This podcast is a member of the Place to Be Nation family. Visit us at placetobenation.com, the only place to be in your pop culture world.
Welcome to the Marvel Age podcast featuring the Sarcastic Four. Episode 1, 1961 through 1962.
Place to Be Nation, pop! Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the very first episode of the Marvel Age podcast. My name is Nick Duke. Maybe a little unusual for you to hear me leading off a podcast. The last time that I did such a thing, I believe one of my esteemed co-hosts yelled at me a lot over the course of 3 hours. One of those co-hosts for this podcast being, of course, Mr. Tim Capel. Tim, how are you doing today?
Very good, Nick. Thank you for that most illustrious introduction. Been looking forward to this show that we have on hand tonight. So, yeah, let's bring in the rest of our panel here.
And of course, we did not come alone, as we rarely do here on Place to Be Nation Pop. We are also joined by the manager himself out on the West Coast, Mr. Todd Weber.
Hi, it's me, the manager, Todd Weber. How's it going?
It's going good, man. How are you?
Doing great. Very excited to talk about what we're going to talk about here.
And finally, but not least importantly, we are also joined by another member of the southeastern contingent of Place to Be Nation Pop. He is the host of the Sellers Points podcast, Mr. Russell Sellers.
I came like fire.
And we all will.
And I was very happy to hear the pop in the introduction. But I was a little disappointed that there was not a follow-up voice right after that.
Well, you know, I'm trying to be kind to at least start this podcast. And it is a podcast. You may be asking yourself, what exactly is a Marvel Age podcast? And the answer to that question is it's going to be a series of podcasts entirely concerning themselves with the publishing history of Marvel Comics, dating back to the very inception of the Marvel Universe all the way back in November 1961. The way we're going to go about this is going to throw a quick shout out here to a website called comicbookherald.com. The individual that runs that site, over the course of many weeks and months, put together a little feature he called My Marvelous Year. And it was essentially a reading club that he had for his, the visitors to his site, where he would compile top 10 lists for each publishing year of Marvel Comics history. Now, these top 10 lists weren't necessarily in terms of sales or even in terms of quality, but more importantly, their relevance to the overall Marvel Universe continuity. And one of the reasons we kind of decided to do this, I think, for Marvel as opposed to their distinguished competition, is that unlike DC, Marvel is very proud of the fact they've never technically entirely rebooted their continuity. And so, however tenuous the links may be today, you could technically trace some of these stories all the way back to November of 1961, and that's what we're going to try to do here. The goal is to go through a year of history per episode, to start with at least. Once we get into some of the more decompressed stories, we're obviously going to have to pause and take our time, but basically what you're going to find here is a snapshot of each year, and this for the very first episode, we're actually going to bring you a little bonus content, because Fantastic Four #1, which as we all know, created the Marvel Universe, was released in November of 1961. So rather than doing an entire episode on just November and December of 1961, we're going to hit November and December of 61 as well as all of 62 in this episode as well. 62, yes. I have to live up to my hard-traveling fanboy gimmicks, even though I have finally unsaddled myself of the hairy weight that is Greg Phillips. So, anyway, with all of that being said, guys, let's get some thoughts on this effort and how excited you guys are to embark on this journey with yours truly.
I think this is going to be a lot of fun. I had a great time going back and rereading these issues. Actually, this is the first time I can't say reread, because this is the first time I have ever read any of these 1960s issues at all. And while it was really fun and I was laughing the whole way, going back and looking at the way that the stories are presented, I'm not entirely sure this was meant to be funny. But but it was, and that is reason enough for anyone to take full advantage of Marvel Unlimited to go back and reread.
Yeah, you mentioned kind of some of the unintentional humor, so let's go over to the person who probably has more context on what comics were like back then than any of us. Todd, kind of fill us in a little bit on the way how
Shots
different not a shot. I mean, I'm not saying he was around in 1961, but he probably experienced these comics at an earlier age than most of us. They were probably still kind of hanging around out there in the ether, whereas, you know, I didn't read Fantastic Four #1 until the last couple of years. So, Todd, just how different were Marvel Comics back in this day and age than they have become today?
Well, compared to today, they were very, very different. But when I had started reading in the late 70s or so, and I'd see occasional reprints in the bookstore or in the, I forget what they're called, the actual softbound books or in Marvel Tales or what have you, you didn't notice that big of a difference, except for perhaps the art. The house style was very different from what we're going to see today with the Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko for the most part. So the difference in the art was tremendous. I was exposed to these books starting in about 1979 to 1982 for most of these. And so they've been around in my head for a long, long time. So going back now and seeing how different they are from what we're reading now, the age of super duper decompressed storytelling, is quite tremendous. And I used to read a book called Marvel Age, a actual Marvel Age comic book, which was Marvel's occasional kind of their checklist for the month coming up. Art on the history and interviews with artists and things. So I kind of like that we're using Marvel Age and keeping that alive, because that was a thing that happened and was an important part of Marvel. So I think the books are quite a bit different in the storytelling now, but not so much from, say, 1978 when I was reading things like Spidey Super Stories, for instance. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that title.
No, I'm actually not, but I'm sure it's something that we'll have the opportunity to talk about as we carry this podcast forward. You know, like I said, our goal here is to do a year of publishing history per episode and stretch those as needed, and we're going to try and bring those episodes to you at least monthly. If we can fit in more than one a month, we'd certainly love to, but we're just going to kind of wait and see what the old schedule allows. So that's kind of the plan here. That's what we're going to shoot to do, and I can't wait to get started. So, guys, I guess let's dig right in and kind of set the stage for people and go all the way back to November of 1961 and talk a little bit about just how different of a place what would come to be known as Marvel Comics was before the Fantastic Four were introduced. You know, each one of us, I think, has done a little bit of supplementary research in addition to our actual reading. You know, I think, Tim, you mentioned reading The Secret History of Marvel Comics. I know Todd and I both looked through a book called Marvel Comics in the 1960s, an issue-by-issue field guide to a pop culture phenomenon. Russell, did you look into any more of like the behind-the-scenes history at the company at this point?
Not terribly, but I was somewhat familiar with it before anyway, that what Marvel was prior to this, before it was even really known as Marvel Comics, they were publishing things such as like different war-based comics, because the publishing history actually does go back to like pre-World War II. And alongside that, there were other like Western comics, horror, sci-fi, and a lot of actually a few titles that survived in, albeit briefly, into their more modern stuff in the late 50s and early 60s. That were anthology titles based in like various sci-fi and horror books. Mm-hmm. So these are things that all existed under that same publishing house long before superheroes were ever even a thought for them. So there's a lot that went into that publishing history in those early days. So I'm sure that we'll probably maybe touch on some of that, but that was my understanding of it prior to the existence of, say, the Fantastic Four in '61.
Absolutely. And they had dabbled a little bit in superhero comics at various points throughout their history prior to this. I mean, Captain America probably being their most notable success in the genre. They had also had the original Human Torch and Namor the Submariner, as we'll get into a little bit later in the show, who kind of hung around from more of the golden age. But for the most part, Marvel as a powerhouse in the superhero game did not come around until November of 1961. So guys, let's jump right to it and talk some Fantastic Four #1. I think each of us have a little bit of a different history with the Fantastic Four. As you've probably heard on Hard Traveling Fanboys for several times, I myself and my normal compatriot Greg Phillips, not huge fans of Marvel's first family. And so I gotta say, all this Silver Age Fantastic Four stuff is a huge blind spot for me. Guys, what was your familiarity level with this run coming into this project, and how much were you looking forward to digging into some of this?
Well, I was, I'm kind of the new guy on the block here with, especially with Fantastic Four, because like you, Nick, I kind of have a very limited history with them. The stuff from the modern age, being what it is, but I was looking forward to diving in and seeing what all this fuss was about, because this was the book that kind of put Marvel on the map as far as their superhero game was concerned. I mean, Fantastic Four was kind of a hit book. And it's also a chance for me to, delve into that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. I guess at the time would have been considered creative genius. It's the early '60s. This is when these guys are really starting to get their feet under them. So it was a chance to see, maybe two powerhouses almost at the height of their power, at the reaching their peak of creativity. So that's where I came at it from.
And that's a good point. I think people kind of think of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby as being these sort of overnight successes as a creative duo, but what you have to keep in mind, and I think what folks don't necessarily understand coming at this from a distance and without having done some of this background research that we are kind of hyper into as big comic book nerds, is that these two were industry veterans. Mm-hmm. I mean, even Stan Lee had been toiling in this field for a good 20 years. So he was no spring chicken coming into this. Jack Kirby certainly was not either.
Yeah, because Kirby had the Captain America creation on his resume back during World War II, a full, 17 years earlier than this.
Exactly. And so the difference here is that while this was not the first time they had worked together, this is the first time they had that kind of, magic and hit it out of the park with a really unexpected but runaway success. Mm-hmm. This was the type of thing that and it wasn't even Marvel Comics at the time. For a large portion of their history, what would become Marvel Entertainment Group, Marvel Comics, whatever you want to call it, was this big shell game essentially, where it was a lot of different companies under that banner, and they were incorporated under a number of different names, basically just to stay in business and to gain tax advantages and distribution advantages. And at this point, they were kind of floundering. Russell had talked about how superhero comics were somewhat out of fashion at this period, the early 60s. The landscape, at least for then timely comics, I guess you could call it, was really dominated by monster comics and anthologies. And so the Fantastic Four was kind of prompted by the success of the Justice League, as I understand it. Mm-hmm. So Martin Goodman basically gave Stan Lee the edict, hey, create a superhero team book for us in the vein of the Justice League. And Lee was kind of not really feeling it at the time, was sort of wanting out of the industry, I think, and not thinking the industry was necessarily healthy enough to have a sustained go at this, but decided to give it a shot and write the kind of superhero team book that he would be interested in reading. Perhaps at the prompting of his wife, as some recollections go.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like a lot of these iconic events. There are so many different versions of it, because I've heard the Martin Goodman prompting him to write a superhero team book version. I've also heard the, Stan himself saying that he was ready to quit and ready to throw in the towel and just wanted to basically write, just one last book exactly the way he wanted to write it, and kind of came up with the Fantastic Four and did that, and it kind of led to this overnight success. So, what the true story is, I don't know that anybody will ever know. And of course, we all know about Stan Lee's contributions. But Todd, talk about Jack Kirby a little bit, because I know you and I both read through this Marvel Comics in the 1960s book, and it kind of shows you at one point a side-by-side comparison of some Jack Kirby art from that time frame, and it does not look like he was putting necessarily his A effort behind Fantastic Four #1.
No, it does not. It looks very rough and very rushed, or kind of phoned in. Not entirely unlike the John Byrne art we see these days. Hi, John. But you compare, good close personal friend of the podcast, John Byrne. You compare what he was doing on books like the Rawhide Kid, where he had these super detailed backgrounds and innovative panels and just awesome, beautiful art that could tell the story without the script even. And then you contrast that with, say, Fantastic Four #1, which we're looking at right now. Very kind of simplified, and the storytelling is fine if you were just to look at that, but the line work is very, very sparse, if you will. So it looks like he could have, knowing his page rate, which was sometimes up to 7-8 pages a day, which is unbelievable for a guy who drew as detailed as he did. He was just a mountain of imagination, and this was something he probably wrote or drew in 2 or 3 days as a work for hire thing. He said, "All right, Stan, whatever you want." And little did we know that this would become the thing that he introduced all these amazing visual concepts for, and even he later in the run, it became kind of the Marvel style, where he would be given a very brief plot. Stan would give him a brief plot, and Jack would draw it, and then Stan would script over that. So Jack was essentially the writer for so many of these big concepts, but you don't get that vibe this first issue, not at all.
That was very much my impression as well, and I wondered if I was alone in that. Just looking at this first issue, which I had read before. I think there was do you guys remember this is before Marvel Unlimited, but the DVDs that were actually released?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think circa 2004-ish, and there weren't many. They did
Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, and Avengers, I think, was all they did, right?
Yeah, I think that was it. Yeah.
I remember because I wanted the Spider-Man
CD-ROMs?
Yes, CD-ROMs that you could actually read these digital books on your computer. Because I remember I wanted to hunt down that Spider-Man one for so long, because this was back before Amazon I think was around, but it wasn't as prevalent as it is today. And me at 2004, I would have still been in high school, so it wasn't this thing that I had necessarily the means to go out and just buy these things.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was in college, I'll say that. But you're right. I mean, you didn't have the resources that we do nowadays. There was no Marvel Unlimited. There was no omnibuses back then. Omnibuses. You had...
There were the Marvel Master.
I was about to say, the big like phone books is what I call them, essentially. The black and white, like newsprint.
The essential.
Yeah, that's the thing. You had the essentials, which were a great value, but they were black and white. So your only option, really, to obtain color versions of these early reprints would have been the Masterworks, which reprinted about 10 issues at a time. It was a great presentation, but for the value, it was sort of like a little bit hard to justify. So when these things hit, it was like, oh, I got to get my hands on this, full color reproductions of just tons of issues I've never, really read in a single spell like this. And so that was when I really came upon these. But anyway, meandering story to get us back on track here. I thought the same thing. It was just these somewhat muddy designs in terms of the characters and a little bit sparse in terms of the backgrounds. Like, you could tell Kirby was probably pressed into service pretty quickly here and turned it around much faster than he probably would if he was putting his best foot forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that. One of the interesting things I want to touch on from a business standpoint before we get into the content of the issue itself, this is a lot bigger risk for Marvel at the time than I think a lot of people realize because of a pretty unique distribution deal that Martin Goodman had entered the company into as a result of kind of making some unwise decisions as it related to his distribution. Basically, he had made the decision to get out of the self-distribution game and go through an intermediary, and that intermediary then failed as a company, and he was left without a way to get the books onto, store shelves. And so he was forced, actually, in the end, to enter into an agreement with National Publications, which was the parent company of then DC Comics. And part of that agreement stipulated that Marvel could only release 8 books a month. Essentially, DC was able to put a restrictor plate on what Marvel could do. So, canceling or having a new title replace a pre-existing title, especially for a superhero title at the time, was a little bit of a risky move. So, it was far from a guarantee that Fantastic Four was going to be a success, especially when it was essentially going to be responsible for generating 1/8 of Marvel's entire revenue stream. It's all they had at that point. So I thought that was really interesting. Were you guys aware of that little business arrangement? I know probably Tim and Todd were because we read about it in our supplemental material.
Yeah, I remember from a while back, like reading up on some of these things. It's been a long time since I've studied up on the history, but the how closely tied Marvel and DC were at one time is a pretty, I'd say, interesting, well-known, and also just it's an important moment in comics because what was coming up would kind of set the pace for the future. Absolutely.
Yeah, and that was a development from the mid-'50s. Atlas signing that distribution deal with American News Company. So, I mean, for a few years, they'd been toiling under this arrangement because ANC went under, like, just a year after that. I mean, it was very ill-fated in the late 50s that, there's this terrible story of Stan Lee, who is an editor in his own right, having to essentially fire the staff because they are now, as you said, limited to 8 titles per month. This restrictor plate that Independent News, DC's distributor, has placed on Martin Goodman, just as a way of sort of curtailing competition. So, and the economics back then are so different than today, where you think of if you want to get buys, then you start with a new number one, right?
Right.
We see all these relaunches of established series, and it's just a new title and name only. It's just slapping a new number one on what you were doing the whole time anyway to drum up the sales. And back then, you really didn't want to start with a new number one. As much as possible, you wanted to keep your existing series going. That's why we see so many of these characters debut in anthology titles, and in many cases remain in those anthology titles much of their publication history.
Anybody who knows me knows there's Go ahead, Todd.
Well, one of these comics we're going to talk about started out in his or its own book and then was folded into one of the continuing anthology books.
Right.
They took away, and we'll talk about that. I mean, they had bi-monthly runs for a lot of these just so that they could get enough variety in their line between romance, horror, western, war, and now fantasies.
Exactly.
And I think because of that restriction, like Todd is saying, though, they were also pretty quick on the trigger for some of these books. Like, if things weren't working for whatever reason, they couldn't afford to, let a book sit out there for 10, 12 issues. They had to make a move, and that we're going to talk about that later on for, I think I know the iconic character that Todd is referring to there.
Yep.
So with all that being said, Fantastic Four #1, of course, Stan Lee on writing duties, Jack Kirby on art. This was my second or third time reading this. Like you guys said, the art itself is a little phoned in, I think. It's a little lazy. It's a little sloppy at points. Stan's writing style is something you're either going to love or hate. It doesn't, I'm going to be honest with you, I don't think Stan ever really became, like, that much more nuanced as a writer. He was kind of just always Stan Lee, and either you love it or you hate it. And I kind of come down on the side of, like, finding it quaintly charming. Like, it's something that would never work in today's day and age. But as a flashback to what was going on back then, I kind of wind up digging it. It has a certain energy to it that most things don't anymore. And I don't know, Fantastic Four #1, I gotta say, I wound up liking it overall, even though I was a little underwhelmed compared to the reputation it kind of has as arguably the most influential book in comics history.
As I was reading it, you guys know how I am sometimes with narration. I like inner monologue and things like that, though I prefer the text boxes to thought bubbles in that regard. When it came to this, though, there's narration all over the place. Some of it even like wholly unnecessary because it's just describing what the artwork is showing you.
Right.
But if you read it in Stan Lee voice, which it is written in his cadence,
yes,
it's actually very easy to be thoroughly entertained by it. You can almost insert true believers in there at any point. Usually at the end of any sentence, just insert that, and it completely works. I'm kind of with you there that the artwork is not great. Even putting it in context of the time period it was in, a lot of male faces all look very, very similar. To the point where, and I can go ahead and mention this as it's the case through several other Fantastic Four issues, and even in amazing adult fantasy issues, where male characters all look like Jack Kirby.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you need a little more modern context, if you're familiar with the actor Ray Wise, they look like him.
There you go.
Very good.
Yeah.
All forehead and eyebrows, right?
They look like vampires in the daylight.
One of the things I picked up on is some of this is a little bit prototypical of what the shared Marvel Universe proper would develop into. This story takes place in Central City, so it's rather...
That's a good point. I didn't even pick on that. Good call, Tim.
It's rather geographically non-specific. Mm-hmm. So, and that would change very quickly, but it's one of those deals where you can tell that they're not planning. This is totally by the seat of their pants. It's not like they're planning, what we know today in terms of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where beat by beat everything is very carefully plotted out. Like I'm sure they had no idea whether they would even get a second issue, let alone a third and 100 plus. Mm-hmm. So a lot of this stuff is sort of...
Maybe that's why every issue seems to say, is this the end of the Fantastic Four? That's a running theme for 9 issues. It's like, okay, Stan,
all right,
we got you.
That's a good thing, Russell, that Russell just did. I'm going to go ahead and let's just get it out of the way. Let's get everybody's best Stan on the record. Todd, give us your Stan.
Face front, true believer. This is a tremendous story from the mighty Marvel House of Ideas.
That's not that far removed.
Figure out which one of the Fantastic Four is a traitor.
The thing I love about Todd's Stan is it's not that far removed from Todd's Larry King. So I think we already have our winner, but let's go through the exercise anyway. Tim?
It's Larry King if he's awake.
Oh God. Is this the end of the Fantastic Four? Excelsior, true believers. Tune in next month or not.
Oh, fuck.
Russell?
I've never done a standard.
Yeah.
I never have either, so mine's going to be by far the worst, which is why I'm saving it for last.
I'm how dare you steal my gimmick, you true believing son of a bitch, Tim Capel. Stay tuned to more episodes of the sardonic, sarcastic, who gives a shit for, because this may be our final episode.
That was a little Vince Russo, so I liked it. I liked it a little bit myself. Okay, here we go. Let's try this one. Excelsior! Across the Rainbow Bridge lies the fabled city of Asgard, where the mighty Thor dwells with his brother Loki and his father Odin.
I like how he took it right into Thor and got us away from Fantastic Four, because that was probably by far the best of the superhero stories that we read during this entire run. And
we will get there. We will get there.
Yeah.
So, Todd, did you have any thoughts on Fantastic Four #1?
No, and I've read this story so many times over the years, whether it was in the Essential Edition or for this reread, or there's quite a great tribute to this particular issue in Byrne's run, and it was, I believe, the 30th anniversary of the team. It could have been 25th, but it had an amazing cover, and it was Terror in a Small Town or something like that. It turned out to be a spoiler, a plot by the Puppet Master, future Fantastic Four villain, but it was basically this origin story without the Mole Man stuff, just the rocket ship and the acquiring of powers, but the panels were redrawn by Byrne. It's just a beautiful story. So I am quite fond of this, and I especially like where they all have the same exact thought balloons. They four are thinking the same thing. That was a favorite moment, and you do have some very iconic stuff that survived, even though Kirby did rush this art, in my opinion.
Yeah, before we move on from it entirely, I'll just go ahead and say that, I mentioned that I enjoyed it already, but one scene I wanted to call out, as Todd mentioned, we do get both the origin story of the Fantastic Four here, as well as a more present-day feature featuring them battling the Mole Man. It's kind of their first activity as a public superhero unit. And my favorite scene here is actually the scene where once they've got their powers, they're all naming themselves, and you get Johnny, Sue, and Ben, who all basically name themselves something that describes what their powers are. Like, for example, I'll read a little bit of the dialogue. Johnny says, "I'm calling myself the Human Torch." Well, he's a Human Torch. I get that. He's on fire. Sue says, "Same for me. Goes for me. I'm the Invisible Girl." Okay, she's a girl. She's invisible. Got it. Ben says, "I'm not Ben anymore. I'm what Susan called me. The Thing." Fine. And then presumptuous ass Reed Richards comes in with, "And I'll call myself Mr. Fantastic." He just decided that he is Mr. Fantastic, not Stretch, not Rubber Man, not any of that. He's going to go with Mr. Fantastic. I thought that made me laugh out loud the first time I read it.
Yeah, and there's plastic and there's elastic, but both of those names would be too close to DC characters. I don't know when Elongated Man came out, or I'm pretty sure Elastic Lad was a thing at this point.
Right,
though.
good point.
Jimmy Olsen. So, yeah, but still, and I'm Mr. Fantastic, just kind of squeezed in there at the very end.
Right.
It does sort of read like maybe they wanted to call him Mr. Elastic and then said, that could be a little bit dicey. We don't want to get any legal hot water with this new. What's something else we could call him? Well, what rhymes with elastic? Fantastic. Name of the series. So there you go. And he's Mr. Fantastic. Question for the panel. I thought that the origin, which, by the way, is told in the span of about a page and a half, maybe 2 pages.
I'm looking at it right now. So they do a flashback to before they go on the rocket ship, where Ben is yelling at Reed that he's not going to go, and then when Susan says she's going to go, Ben changes his mind. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pages is the origin.
5 pages.
Yep.
Okay. Somewhat emblematic of the comics we're going to discuss and the origin stories we're going to see, especially in these early goings of Marvel Comics. They just kind of hit the ground running.
Yeah.
Throw this stuff out here. There are some pacing issues with these comics, but when it comes to character origins, it's kind of like, here you go. this is not a. We're not going to spend a whole issue doing this. We're not going to spend an entire arc on this. It's just. It's a flashback. You have it.
What you're saying is it is decidedly not the Ultimate Universe approach of giving 6 issues to every origin story.
Right, and I'm not knocking that by any means. It's just it's very, very different, and it's
like we said earlier, they kind of couldn't.
No, they did not have that luxury at the time, certainly. Yeah. But I think my overall point that I was going for is that this origin is interesting to me in that it kind of reads like the makings of a cautionary tale, that it wouldn't necessarily be out of place in one of the horror anthologies that were somewhat popular of the time period. But then it just sort of takes this sharp detour, right, where they crash land back on Earth and then have these strange sudden transformations and decide, oh no, wait, we're a superhero comic. We're superheroes. That's what we're going to do. So, I don't know. It's kind of playing in that zeitgeisty thing of the time where maybe expectations of the readership was this is one thing, this is going to be a monster comic, which the cover certainly leads you to believe that, and then it just skirts your expectations. So that was a little bit interesting to me.
Yeah, you had DC had already had Jack Kirby do Challengers of the Unknown, and you get a lot of that vibe, like they're facing the monster, and they're not Challengers aren't a family, but you do have that kind of imprint on here. But what made this unique, I think, is their family dynamic, and continued to evolve over the next 100 or so every issues. I can't believe how many times Ben Grimm says "bah." Here.
Yeah, that's a great thing that we should probably also mention.
His voice is way off.
Yes, I was going to say, Reed Richards and Sue Storm and Johnny Storm are all kind of written like a Silver Age version of their modern characters. Like, you can see how there are elements of those personalities that carry forward to today. But Ben Grimm, I gotta say, man, I don't see a single thing. There is no ever-loving, blue-eyed thing in this comic, in my opinion. And it's something they definitely evolve over time. Even by the end of 1962, as we'll get into later on, you can start to see some of those elements coming back out. But it's almost like the Thing is the the villain within the Fantastic Four throughout several of these early issues.
He certainly is, and there are moments when he's almost more Hulk-like than he is. That's like the Thing that we all know and love, because as you pointed out, he's not very lovable through most of these early issues. In fact, there are many times where it's like, is he going to turn on the team? Is this guy even really somebody that I can root for? Because I had a hard time with him.
I did too.
At numerous times, thinking he's the biggest asshole in this story, even placed up against certain villains, like in the story in this very issue against the Mole Man. I kind of felt bad for Mole Man, and there are times whenever I was like, "Thing, you're a bigger villain than he is."
And it's weird because Ben Grimm in the flashback starts out as kind of the voice of reason,
right?
Who's telling them, we really should not do this.
Almost, but he goes into like a bipolar mood swing.
Yes.
All of a sudden, when Sue brings up that she's going to go, and it's like he's goaded into it by being called a coward, and then all of a sudden he's just like loses all reason and just jumps right into it. And it's like, my God, how unstable are you?
That's another early story element that I wasn't even aware of, because I think for so many years we've all grown up with, Reed and Sue married and together and with kids at a certain point. And in these early issues, they're kind of sort of trying to do a love triangle thing at times, even though it's pretty clear which one she prefers of the two. So it's not really a triangle, but it's definitely implied there's kind of a Wolverine, Cyclops, Jean Grey type situation going on.
That's a thing.
Especially after Reed gets his powers, am I right?
Oh.
Yeah, it's very much so.
Mark it down, take a drink, folks. There's the first one.
There's the first superhero sex reference.
Won't be the last, because we've all seen Mallrats.
We have indeed.
We've all been Brody at some point or another in our lives. But that's neither here nor there. The point being that Ben Grimm himself is pretty unstable and portrayed as such throughout these early issues. But I noticed that once Namor is introduced, then all of that starts to really disappear.
Yeah.
Stabilizes a little bit.
Yeah.
And we're gonna definitely get into that, and I'm looking forward to talking that issue. But I can't think of a better way to transition into our next title that we read than by going from superhero sex reference straight into an amazing adult fantasy. Because on our list we had Amazing Adult Fantasy number 7, and I think the purpose of having this on the list was not so much its role in establishing the early Marvel Universe, because it doesn't. It has nothing to do with the Marvel Universe. It's completely out of continuity. But more to compare what Marvel was to what it would become eventually as superhero comics became the company's predominant means of revenue. So, Amazing Adult Fantasy, not to dwell on it too much, I gotta say, I didn't really wind up liking this one because I didn't find the stories that interesting, but controversial opinion coming from me, at least for this initial 1961-1962 period, give me Steve Ditko art over Jack Kirby.
I'm going to agree with that, and I'm going to put the caveat on it that I know you said you didn't like this issue. This was my favorite issue of the ones I read.
Really? Okay.
Yes. Amazing Adult Fantasy number 7 was far and away of this set of issues the one that I enjoyed the most, and it was really because it was so different. It was giving me a peek of what Marvel Comics was prior to its superhero prominence, and there are several of these stories that they had me laughing out loud. Witch Hunt, for instance, like throws a real twist at the end.
Didn't see that one coming.
Nope. But as I got there, I was like, okay, well, this is all about the Salem witch trials, and this woman has been falsely accused of being a witch. This dude goes to all this trouble to save her and everything, and then by the end of it, oh no, their wagon turns over and she's hurt on the road to wherever it is they're going. And he's like, stay here, honey, I'll get help. She's like, but it's miles away. How are you going to do that? And he's like, yeah, you thought you're not the only one who can ride a broom. He pulls that out and flies off.
These are very much almost like
with his feet in the air.
Yes.
These are very much almost like Twilight Zone type stories where it's a 5-story book. It's an anthology book, got 5 stories in here. The ones in this one are a story called Why Won't They Believe Me, which was about a guy who was convinced that there was an alien walking among the Earthlings dressed disguised as a human. The Last Man on Earth, which I bet you can guess what that's about. Witch Hunt, like Russell mentioned, that kind of has this Salem witch trial setting. Journey's End, which is a time travel story where this thief winds up getting accidentally sent back in time. And then Icy Fingers of Fear, which I don't even remember what it was about because I was checked out by that point. Somebody help me out on Icy Fingers of Fear. Anybody remember?
I'm trying to remember exactly that one because that was my least favorite of.
Oh, this is the one where the aliens come to Earth. And they're being antagonistic towards each other, and then at the end, like the human child and the alien child swap toys.
Oh yeah, and
they have the little piece thing. So,
Star Trek TNG episode.
Yeah.
The Last Man on Earth though had an ending that I felt was maybe cut off a little bit because there's that last panel of him realizing, oh no, maybe I didn't want to be alone after all. But I was like, nah, I'm pretty sure if you gave that one more panel, you'd have this dude being like, this is the greatest moment of my life. I had this whole planet to myself. All of them are gone.
Okay to me. Yeah.
And he's like, wait a minute. You mean there was no nuclear destruction? Everyone just left and everything is intact and still here and working? Hell. Talk about a great day.
And, the most notable thing about that whole story was to me the character design of the lead character. It kind of had a lot of similarities to the J. Jonah Jameson we would see, not all that much longer away from Steve Ditko.
Yes, just put a little Hitler mustache on this dude, and you've got J. Jonah Jameson. I will say the first story didn't necessarily hit with me.
No, me either.
Completely.
You didn't like the Clayface-esque aliens.
It was the twist at the end because I was like, he's gonna wind. As it went along, I was like, he's gonna wind up being the creature, isn't he? And
it's a little obvious.
And it was a little obvious and just not that well thought out. But Journey's End, I thought, was really great. mostly for its paradoxical twist ending.
Yeah.
Where it calls out that this is why time travel as a plot device doesn't actually work.
Yes.
Yeah.
It acknowledges that it broke the story.
Yep.
Yes, it acknowledges that, wait a minute, I went back and I accidentally killed the dude who invented time travel, so I got blasted back to the future. But if that's the case, how did I ever time travel in the first place?
Yeah.
And I was like, yep, let it break your brain for a minute. And calling out the time travel paradox for what it is with this horse-faced motherfucker in this story. Look at him on the last page. He's got a horse face. Sarah Jessica Parker, you got nothing on this.
He absolutely does, but again, I will say, at least for Steve Ditko, his faces were all distinct from one another, unlike some of this early Jack Kirby stuff that we're seeing.
You're absolutely right. At least I can tell all these characters apart.
Right.
They all look very different, and Steve Ditko, I think I'm kind of with you here. I feel like he's the superior artist.
Now, here's the thing to keep in mind. While these stories individually may not be great achievements or super memorable, they are 5 independent, self-contained stories within one issue of an anthology series. So you got to figure month after month after month, this is what Stan Lee and Steve Ditko are basically churning out. I cannot imagine. I mean, you referenced the Twilight Zone earlier with Rod Serling basically as what we would think of today as the showrunner and producing all of these scripts and having to maintain a level of creativity and, frankly, stamina that seems totally confounding to me today. Like, I cannot imagine having to be on at this level and being like, okay, now I have to be in that creative mode of coming up with 5 stories that need to go to press, and deadline pressure is looming. You know, you can see the whites of my eyes, and I've gotten through that, and I got to do the exact same thing the next month. For however long they did this, and for however many different series that they did this in, you know?
Wasn't Twilight Zone a thing at this point?
Yeah.
Had it started yet?
By 1961, I would assume so.
Because if it existed, and just looking at the way these stories are structured, and even the content, I'm reasonably sure that Stan was just watching Twilight Zone and ripping off story ideas.
Yeah, and I mean, again, these
Twilight Zone began in 1959, so yes, it was definitely a story.
So yeah, I'm reasonably sure that's what was happening.
Yeah.
But at the same time, yes, these stories seem a little bit obvious and they have twists, but you have to do that and churn these out just at an incredible pace and rate. It just boggles the mind, really, that they were able to do this without succumbing to burnout that I cannot imagine. Like, I couldn't do this for 2 months, let alone years, which really they were at this for years.
I agree with that, actually.
At DC, you had House of Mystery and House of Secrets, and this reads kind of as almost maybe a sci-fi version of that for the most part. I want to draw attention to the cover. If you notice the cover of here, Amazing Adult Fantasy #7, what is the font that they use for the title?
I'm trying to get back there. Hold on. Give me a second. Is it Comic Sans?
It is not. It's not.
Whatever it is, it's the same font as Fantastic Four.
It's the exact same font as Fantastic Four.
Yeah.
So I don't know. This came out a month before. Maybe just whoever was pasting these up, Artie Simek or somebody in the bullpen.
What I'll also notice on the cover is the frat boy length shorts on this kid for Amazing Adult Fantasy #7.
Somewhat unique.
Those are a good 8 inches above his knee, I would say.
Now, guys, this is the magazine that respects your intelligence.
Yes.
How respected does your intelligence feel?
Does that not sound like a Steve Ditko line, knowing what little we know about him? Like, you know what I mean? Like, It sounds like something that Ditko came up with rather than Stan, to me anyway.
mean,
I wonder how Ditko must have felt about the overall message of. Anyway, we'll get there.
Yeah.
I
try
not to judge it from that standpoint, though, because in the modern era, I've seen these stories before. I've seen hundreds of stories exactly like these. So if I were a kid in the 1960s buying this and reading it, I might have been okay with that. I might have been like, this is some really smart stuff. But, you put it in the modern context, not really. This has all been done.
Yeah. So, don't want to spend too much more time on this because we're here to kind of talk about the evolution of the Marvel Universe as we know it. So let's move right on to the next issue on our chronological reading. And that was, of course, Fantastic Four #2. And I think this is a sneaky contender for my favorite issue that we read because I don't know that it was so intentionally ridiculous, but good Lord, was it ridiculous and fun and awesome as we get the introduction of a character and a concept that will pop up throughout the Marvel Universe for decades to come, even appearing to this day, those being the Skrulls and the Skrull Empire making their first attempt at invading Earth. Still artistically here, for me anyway, Jack isn't exactly bringing his best work, but he's bringing better than he did in issue 1. And the Skrulls, even from the very beginning, are visually appealing enough to me that I wound up really, really liking this, especially with some of the unintentional humor. So, Todd, what were your thoughts here on Fantastic Four #2?
Yeah, it's just a lot of fun. And the first time you see Reed Richards morph into a Skrull, it's kind of shocking, but they are the prototypical little green men. They just with this paranoid aspect that they could be your friends too. So they're body snatchers in a way as well, but they can be so much more with their abilities. And I'm a big fan of the villain Super Skrull who comes up years later. But his gimmick was that he had all the powers of the Fantastic Four. Not just a shape changer, but he had the powers themselves. So
and he didn't have to gimmick the powers like some of the Skrulls in this story do.
And I do like when they meet the Skrull Supreme Leader and his helmet and everything. It is pretty darn hilarious.
This also featured a plot that Stan would go to God knows how many times over the years of imposters disgracing the hero's good name. Because we get the Skrulls disguised as the Fantastic Four going out and committing these heinous acts, and which leads to the Fantastic Four being put under military arrest, which actually leads to one of my favorite scenes in the book.
Oh my God.
Where Mr. Fantastic is locked in the cell and trying to figure a way out, and then finally he finds a loose screw in the room and forces the screw out and then squeezes his entire body through the screw hole, which is like, it's one of those things that's ridiculous and funny, but it makes you kind of understand why Josh Trank thought that he could make a David Cronenberg style adaptation of the Fantastic Four, because body horror, it should have, there is an element of that could work, even going all the way back here. So I thought that scene was awesome. Not even funny, just awesome.
I lost it at that scene.
Yeah.
Well, the head sticking through the screw hole. It's just brilliant.
Yes.
It's just fantastic.
Yes.
Pun intended.
I did think that the Skrulls looked a little bit like green Ferengi. Again, with the Star Trek references here, I'm sorry, but
okay.
They aren't sort of the Skrulls as we would come to know them, I think, later on.
No, they've got the pointy ears, and they've got the lined chin, but beyond that, they have not yet really locked down the character design that we would all come to know and love.
Right, and the thing that's sort of funny here is that, okay, it's established that the Skrulls, they have mastered interstellar travel, for one thing, right? They're on Earth. And they're shapeshifters. They rely on sabotage and subterfuge. That's kind of their go-to move. But their intel on Earth is like complete shit, right?
Yeah.
Apparently, they're snowed very easily by this scheme on the part of the Fantastic Four to dissuade them from invading. So,
and just tremendous cross promotion here. Like, buy these comics that I'm going to mention that I stole this
right
plot from.
Yes, in-universe references to other comics that are being published that aren't necessarily superhero comics, since we're somewhat new out of the gate here. But yeah, Mr. Fantastic referencing other comics that you can purchase here. So Stan already getting a little bit cheeky there with these references.
Not even photos, drawings.
Right. That's great.
Yep.
The team still is not in their costumes yet. So
That's a good point. I have not even picked up on that. Yeah. So we're still kind of pre the established Baxter Building costume Fantasticar elements that we all have come to know over the years. Russell, your thoughts on Fantastic Four #2? I don't know if you were as high on it as it seems like the rest of us were.
Oh no, this was hilarious.
Yeah,
unintentionally so, but yeah, I was. This was the first time that I was just as I was sitting down and really reading it, I stopped being irritated by the bad art and the dated references, and just started laughing my ass off at how ridiculous some of this is.
Yeah,
and the screw hole. Yeah, you guys pretty much called it on that one.
Yeah,
but I think it's the
ending, right?
Ending.
Oh my God, the ending!
Yeah.
The ending is like.
But before I get to that, there is one thing. There was one
It was
thing
paid off years later.
there's just one thing that was really irking me. They go through all this trouble of framing the Fantastic Four. Everyone believes that the Fantastic Four have totally turned. You know, they're the bad guys, right?
Right.
And Mr. Fantastic is like, no, I can prove it. We have these things locked up at our apartment, and that's where they are, at an apartment. There's nothing keeping them there. There is no reason for these Skrulls to have stayed in this spot. But they take the cops there, open the door, and the Skrulls have shapeshifted into all manner of like creatures to attack them. But when they opened the door, I was like, how funny would it have been if there was nobody there?
They just left. Yeah.
Yeah, if they just left, what was keeping them there? Because that window wasn't locked. There was a window in the room they could have gone through. In fact, they do. They go through the window. There's nothing keeping them there.
How convenient.
Yes. But then, yes, we have to get to the ending.
Oh,
There's two things I got to get to on the end, too, but go for it.
Yes.
Yeah.
They convinced the Skrull leader to leave Earth without the Fantastic Four themselves proving to be actual Skrulls. They're just like, oh no, this is Earth defenses are too much for you. You can't handle this. Get out of here.
And they get an award. They get the Skrull Medal of Honor, essentially.
Yes. Stolen valor by the Fantastic Four of this issue.
They get
2
this
issues
award. And then and in true Stan Lee fashion, every time he ends this, it's like, this is it. This is forever. They're never coming back. Bullshit. Skrulls are like, well, Stan, if the rumors are true, would know all about a bad case of crabs. But in any case, the Skrulls leave, but they're still stuck with these Skrull prisoners on Earth. Mm-hmm. So like, oh, what do we do with them? Oh, I'm going to hypnotize them so that they believe that they are whatever they are, the last thing they change into, which happens to be a few cows. That's right. They change into cows.
And the Fantastic Four
literally put out to pasture.
Yes. Yes.
My favorite is we hate being Skrulls.
Yes, self-loathing.
We'd rather be anything else.
Yep. Okay, you're going to be cows. Boy, what happens whenever these cows are, being led to slaughter?
Oh, my dude. That question gets answered.
It gets answered years and years later. Look at the second to last panel.
Does it really?
Oh, it does. Yeah, Tim
Yeah,
will.
it does. It really does.
But
we're not kidding.
what does he do to make them forget?
hypnotizes them.
He
Read the word
Hynotizes them. Yes, I'm glad you picked up on that because there is a major typo I want to talk about later on that I think you guys probably noticed as well. So, yeah, this was, I gotta say, a big step up from issue number 1 and kind of sets the tone for what the book is going to be going forward. Just zany and energetic and
it's campy.
Yeah, it is, but like, you know, in a 60s style back then that was in vogue. And so like, you know, it's something that really works even today. So I wound up really enjoying this Fantastic Four number 2. So let's move on to something that I did not enjoy as much, and I don't think many other people did on the panel either. And let's go to the debut of one of the most iconic characters in all the Marvel Universe, and let's jump over to the Incredible Hulk. He made his debut in May of 1962 with Incredible Hulk number 1. This is Marvel yet again seeking to launch a new concept with a number 1 issue rather than debuting him in a pre-existing title. And this time, as Todd alluded to earlier, it was a risk that didn't wind up paying off as well as Fantastic Four number 1. So here for the Hulk, you've got Stan Lee on the writing again, Jack Kirby on the art. You've got Paul Ryman on the inks. By the way, I want to call out both of the Fantastic Four issues that we've talked about thus far were inked by a guy named George Klein. So he is kind of the unsung third member of that initial Fantastic Four creative team. But anyway, delving into the Hulk, this is, you know, you get the iconic origin with the Gamma Bomb and with Rick Jones being out there and Bruce Banner going to save him and taking the brunt of the radiation for him. But other than the origin, there is not much here that resembles the Hulk that we have come to know in the years since. It goes from the origin to a guy on the run story to a very bizarre subplot involving some individual known as the Gargoyle, who is like a high-ranking member of Russian intelligence who wants to fight him, and then Bruce winds up saving this guy. It was all over the place. They were fitting what felt like 2 or 3 issues worth of story into one story, and kind of a mess here, in my opinion. What did you guys think of Incredible Hulk number 1?
Very much a mess. That's a great way to describe it. But I think we also have to point out that Rick Jones definitely has a crush on Bruce Banner. Because
that may be reciprocal.
And it very well could be, because
are we saying this is a Tim Capel, Tom Holland like situation here in Incredible Hulk number 1?
Well, take another drink, I guess. There's one of those, but
yeah, I'm going to say that it is very likely true, because Betty Ross is in this story, though it doesn't really make any sense why she's in the story. She's not working on this project. She's just the daughter of Thunderbolt Ross, who's the military head over this Gamma Bomb project, and it made no sense for Betty to even be there, and she and Bruce are not even together. Like that's said up front that they're not a couple. They've actually just met. But after his first transformation into Hulk, he and Rick are back at Bruce's place, and Betty comes over to check on him because he had disappeared for a while. He's kind of roughed up, and in Rick's thought bubble, as Bruce is talking to her at the door, he's like, "Oh, it's Betty now." Blah, how revolting. And then, very next panel after she's gone, he's like, "Boy, I thought they'd never leave. Now we can talk." He's like, "What did it feel like, Doc, being the Hulk?" I'll bet it was a gas. And speaking of which, how about you show me? And that's I am so for this, and I'm sorry to interrupt and derail your train of thought here, but I think this is also improved immeasurably by reading Bruce Banner's voice as Bruce Manhattan. In fact,
there you go.
Okay, well, you have to tune into Comic Book Theater for that.
That is so
Yeah,
man.
that's a nice plug, though. It's a nice plug. Comic Book
is.
Theater, which is, of course, an episode of the Hard Traveling Fanboys, who are, by the way, the longest-running weekly episode. That all place to be.
At this point, the manager is tired of hearing it.
No, I'm fine with it.
Here's what I
Rick
don't.
Jones is a little handsy, man.
He is.
Rick Jones is very handsy, but can we point out something else? Rick Jones did not accidentally walk into the test area of the Gamma Bomb. He drove in there in a car on a dare and is sitting in the back
Quite
seat.
nonchalantly.
Yeah, very nonchalantly sitting in the back seat of his car when Bruce is running up on him. He's playing a harmonica, because of course he is. But instead of Bruce saying, "Oh shit, there's a car right here. You drove in here? Cool. Maybe we could turn and drive it out of here." No, he grabs him out of the car and says, "Let's go on foot. This is a better idea." To this trench that may or may not actually protect us from the blast. And yeah, I'm just it was absurd. The whole bit here is just nonsense. Given their own rules, but
Although I will say,
there's one thing I can say for it: the artwork,
yeah, that's what I was about to say.
Improved over Jack Kirby's previous effort in Fantastic Four. This is a massive improvement.
Well, it very much feels almost like more of a monster story, which makes you wonder if maybe that wasn't more in Kirby's wheelhouse or his mind space at the time.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I feel like just reading this, it doesn't even feel like it was meant to be a superhero story necessarily until we get to the whole, well, he's fighting the commies. All right, we got to put that in there, I suppose. It's, Cold War America. But at the same time, the idea that America would, create a weapon that could invariably turn it into, the very monster that it's trying to fight, I thought was a, great bit of symbolism for the era, and feels like that's what Hulk was, really being created for, really getting at. Though, like you guys pointed out earlier, by the time we actually get to that part of the story, when we get to the whole, the gargoyle and all that other, spy and Soviets, the Soviets? all of that, yeah, the story has gone fully off the rails, and it's like Stan has really lost his own narrative.
And the gargoyle face turn cracks me up every
Yes!
time.
That
Really
is weird.
does. It is so odd and just out of left field. It was correctly stated earlier that this issue is all over the place, and it is a train wreck that is sometimes funny, oftentimes pretty to look at, but going back on it, it is just weird. And the whole idea, they basically made Hulk a werewolf, but without the need of a full moon. He transforms into Hulk at night.
Yes, that's one thing we should probably mention. Yeah, not a rage-triggered transformation. It is Hulk by night, Banner by day, triggered by, like Russell said, the light of the moon. Not even a full moon, just a moon in general, it seems like. And
Just nighttime.
Yeah.
The sun, he changes.
Yeah, and the Hulk is grayish. In some lights, he has a little bit of a green hinge to him, I think, but very much gray Hulk here in the early going.
And he speaks.
Yeah, and he speaks in complete sentences, yes.
He doesn't even necessarily, his first time transforming, he doesn't even necessarily have a completely different personality. He's not quite as smart as Bruce Banner, but he still has Bruce's memories.
He's a little bit more gruff, but he's not the rage monster that you come to expect from the Hulk.
He gets a little bit more of that as the issue goes along, though. So it was like Stan, when he started writing the story, thought, oh, well, I'll have him be, more of a Jekyll and Hyde thing, but a Hyde who's aware of who he really is. But then as he went along, he's like, nah, it's more fun the other way. So I'll just change it halfway through the story, and nobody'll care. They'll dig it, and I guess they did, because here we are all these years later, and Hulk is, well, He's one of the most popular Marvel characters there is.
But did they necessarily dig this an early incarnation? Because as Todd alluded to earlier, this book only lasts 6 issues.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that's probably the strongest point to be made here is that they were committed to the character, but not this version. Mm-hmm.
Funny how sensibilities then were maybe not so different from our sensibilities today, because we're not really digging on this issue, so easy to see why.
And talk about pulling the plug very early on. 6 issues and gone.
Yep.
Hell, people were criticizing the New 52 for giving people 8 issues and canceling them.
Right.
It's like, think back to the 1960s. They cut you off at 6.
Yeah.
You get 2 of the 3 issues we've looked at. We've had very heavy Red Menace themes, or at least
very much so.
So we have that kind of the Cold War looming over all of these comics, and you had the bomb was 15 years ago at this point, so 17 years ago. So you still had that, and you had kids in classes having to do bomb drills and shelters being built, and just everything you could do with a bomb allegory or a bomb story. It was a pretty smart idea for them to do this, but I don't know. I think Betty is pretty darn useless here.
Yeah.
You really don't get any.
She's
Betty
really
loss.
not a character in this comic. She's just sort of there.
And that'll kind of be the case for other characters that we're going to talk about in issues that we've read. Jane Foster in particular comes to mind, where she pops up randomly in one of the Thor issues we're going to talk about, and that's pretty much her only use. So, yeah, Thunderbolt Ross, though, is here, and pretty much the same Thunderbolt Ross that, just yelling generically angry, as he would be in virtually every Hulk appearance that I've ever read. So, at least that element is somewhat familiar, but... Yeah, overall, other than the art, which, like Russell said, I thought was a huge step up from Kirby's efforts on Fantastic Four 1 and even 2, even though I liked his art more on 2 than I did 1, to me this is the best drawn Kirby issue we've seen to this point. So, any other thoughts you guys want to get on Incredible Hulk number 1 before we move on?
Not on Hulk number 1, but there was something I wanted to mention since Todd brought up nuclear weapons. Anybody else notice that Johnny Storm in Fantastic Four number 1, as he's flying away from these planes, is having nuclear missiles shot at him?
The National Guard shot a nuclear missile at him.
Not just one, but several. And I'm like, holy shit. What? You can tell that Stan Lee and anyone producing these books had no clue how the destructive force of a nuclear bomb.
Well, and Mr. Fantastic just grabs it out of the sky.
Yeah, he just totally reached up and was like, oh, I got this. Like, okay, yeah, that's totally a thing that can happen. Jackass.
No, I definitely had that. I'm glad you pointed it out.
It's nuts. And it's not the last time that will happen.
No, it's not.
Nuclear bombs are actually going to be a thing even in the very next issue that we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
Fantastic number 4.
Yeah, so we are moving on to Fantastic Four number 4. Again, we're doing the, quote, 10 most important stories of the year, so we're not just going to move sequentially and read every issue of Fantastic Four ever, so we're jumping from Fantastic Four 2 into Fantastic Four number 4, and here we're going to get, as we alluded to earlier, the re-debut of the Submariner, drawing back to one of Marvel's earliest efforts in the superhero game. We get Namor the Submariner being reimagined here as something more of a villain. I gotta say, another issue of Fantastic Four that I come down on the side of really liking. It establishes early on the rivalry between Reed and Namor for the affections of Sue. It establishes the fact that Sue, very early on in her superhero career, had her very own Me Too moment, given the fact that she was subjected to constant sexual harassment at the hands of Namor the Submariner. So,
he has boundary issues.
It has admitted
very much so.
Boundaries and consent issues, very much.
Yep.
So. Yep. I do think, however, his introduction to the story was a little silly, like with him in a homeless shelter, forgetting who he was and all that stuff. But
being hot shaved yes. by the Fantastic Four's or by the Human Torch's finger.
Yes.
Yeah. Anybody tried that? Have you ever given yourself a shave by lighter?
By blowtorch?
Yeah, or by
no.
blowtorch?
No. Nor have I.
You know, the smell alone, I feel like would really.
Yeah.
Yes, like singed hair. That's just going to be.
And Namor here had like a hipster beard going on, so it would have been a lot of hair that had to be singed off.
Hang on. Millennial beard,
excuse me.
As Tony Schiavone would say.
And it's hilarious because just before Johnny Storm realizes that Namor is potentially this homeless man sitting there in this little halfway house with him. He was reading a Submariner comic.
Yep.
Convenience.
He was reading a fucking Submariner comic. But one thing I did want to mention before we get deep dive on this one, this is the debut of the official Fantastic Four uniform.
Well, they actually debuted it. An actually moment, I'm sorry.
Did they do it in 3?
They did do it in 3, which I don't entirely understand why it was skipped in our reading list / book club, but you know, we're sticking to the format sheet.
Right. Yeah, I don't really understand that either.
That's not your format sheet, Nick. That's not a knock at you. You're sticking to your format sheet that was prescribed.
Right.
So.
And also, I mean, isn't this I could be wrong, but was issue 3 a Puppet Master issue?
No, issue 3 was not, but there is a Puppet Master issue that is skipped.
That is skipped and introduces Alicia. So later on, one of the books we read, Alicia's just there, and it's...
Yeah, I think it was 7 or 8.
Right.
Anyway.
But anyway, I also wanted to call out that, you know, as he's shaving the Submariner with his finger, there is an image at one point where the Submariner has got very female-like features. I think it's the one with, like, if you just look at his eyebrows and his eyes in the second panel of him being shaved, it kind of looks like a chick.
Is a bit effeminate.
Yeah.
In appearance, he's got that whole like Olympic swimmer thing going on, and the elf ears don't really do him any favors. But you notice, I think that this is also where some people's ideas on Aquaman actually came from. The idea that Aquaman would have to be in water all the time in order for his powers to work or for him to be able to survive. Mm-hmm. Because the Submariner, the further away from water he gets, the more human, I guess, he becomes, or the less powerful he is. But as they point out over and over and over again in this issue, once he's back in the ocean, he fully remembers who he is and is, as they said, invincible.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't recall, but does Namor say, "You remind me of another person who was coincidentally called the Human Torch 20 years ago"?
You would think.
You would
who I had a massive battle with and flooded the entire city, which is now New York, by the way. You would think that would come up, but it doesn't.
Yes, yes, a good point. We are no longer in Central City. We are definitely in New York.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And also,
we have Fantastic Cars.
Mm-hmm.
We've got the Fantastic Car, the giant bathtub that separates.
Yes.
Very good.
And Russell mentioned, Submariner Comics being in the issue. We also get Stan, because this issue was released the same month as Incredible Hulk #1. Along some of these pages, you have like just random lettering at the bottom or top of the pages, stuff like
bottom of 2.
The Hulk is coming. Who is the Hulk? It's
like fire.
The Hulk is coming. What is the Hulk? You've never seen anyone like the Hulk. Just Stan working in these advertisements for this new book. So I thought that was really interesting. But yeah, you get here,
and this is pre Stan soapbox. This is
right.
pre Mighty Marvel, the Marvel Bulletin, and Mighty Marvel Marching Society, and all that shit. I mean, that's gonna take form in subsequent episodes here pretty quickly, I think. But here we're kind of seeing the beginnings of that with really, the huckster type Stan.
Yeah.
Yeah. This was actually according to Marvel Unlimited, released the same exact day as Hulk #1. Now, I don't know. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but it is a bit of synergy. I think the art is a lot better at this point. Lots more detail, lots more action at times. And then there's certain pages where there's some simplified things going on and no backgrounds. You also have Ben Grimm continuing to go back and forth between human Ben Grimm and the Hulk. And then, of course, he's wearing boots, which is awesome.
Yes. He had a full costume the issue before this, which the Invisible Girl designed their costumes, and he had a full body suit. Of course she did, right? He had a full body suit, including like a kind of helmet type thing, which he discards very quickly and strips down to basically his skivvies and boots. So holdover from the previous issue with his somewhat unusual attire here. I also took note of the fact that the art is substantially improving. Thing no longer looking like a mud monster, and the Human Torch no longer looking like a candle wick. So we're getting there. Not quite there yet, but it's coming along.
Well, this was also the first of our issues that we've read of FF that was inked by Saul Brodsky instead of George Klein. So do you guys think that made any of a difference at all?
I think it may have made a little bit, but as Tim alluded to about Johnny Storm's look between the first 2 issues to here, he no longer looks like he is, come like fire, or fire like come, as you may want to describe the look of it. He was just a little like red-orange blob, and now he actually looks like a person flying through the air. So no, I actually think that Jack Kirby decided to stop fucking around and said, and realized that, this book is actually a hit.
Yeah.
It's got to look good if people are going to keep buying it. So, all right, let me put effort into this now that I'm actually really making money off of it.
Yeah. By this point, they had to have known what they kind of had on their hands. So.
Oh, certainly. By now, they know they've got a hit.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it was still bi-monthly at this point, too.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
so you had a little bit of extra time to see how the sales numbers and letters.
Yeah, like he's going to see those numbers go up. He's going to start taking his time with the art instead of just rushing through it, saying, all right, let me get this out so Stan will get off my back. And he's like, I'm actually making money at this? Cool.
And there's another appearance of nuclear weapons here, as the Thing carries a giant nuclear bomb into the belly of this giant whale, essentially, to keep it from attacking the city, which is pretty funny.
There's our nuclear bomb reference I was getting to.
Yep. And you get...
this...
Go ahead, Tim.
This wrap up to this story, the conclusion kind of turns into an episode of Power Rangers, where the Submariner summons this great sea leviathan using his trumpet horn from the depths of the ocean, and so you have this rampaging beast destroying the city of New York.
Can we also just point out that the way they beat him is so stupid?
It's pretty bad.
They beat him by creating a vortex, so much so to the point where he loses his grip on the horn. It falls into the ocean, where he also falls, and it kind of seems like they didn't fall that far apart from one another. And given that he can swim at such great speeds under the ocean, is invincible, is potentially immortal, how lazy a motherfucker is Namor to just straight up give up looking for this horn and go on about his business.
He does the literal fist shake at the Fantastic Four as he's beaten, shaking his fist and yelling that he'll be back.
How did you like that pseudoscience, though, of the Human Torch creating this vortex with such great pressure that sweeps up Namor?
Laughably bad, hilarious, and it's like, okay, you have a character in Namor who is Atlantean, who is of the ocean, is evolved to survive at the crushing depths of the sea floor, and you are expecting me to believe that the Human Torch could spin so fast that he creates a pressure vacuum that that Namor couldn't just like walk through like it was nothing. Bullshit. This was the one of the most eye-roll inducing endings of these issues yet.
Yeah.
But I did really like the way that Stan wrote Namor's character. So I got to give him at least that. And the as we pointed out earlier, the artwork substantially improved.
Yeah. And all this could have been avoided if Susan had just become a sex slave like he wanted.
Yeah. Save the people.
Yeah, would have been a hell of an entertaining issue and a more believable ending.
Yep.
Well, I'm going to earn my no prize and say that Susan was subconsciously creating an invisible force field over his brain or his gills, and so he was losing oxygen, and so that caused him to succumb. She just didn't know what she was doing. It was her developing powers that did it. Do I get my no prize? Absolutely true believer.
The first no prize of our show.
They actually offered to send a letter writer $5 for coming up with the explanation of how the diamond that the fake Skrull Invisible Woman steals at the beginning of issue 2, how that became invisible as well when all she did was shrink down, right? Yeah. So a letter writer said, hey, how is this possible? And the response was, well, if you can come up with an explanation, we'll send you $5. So this was their version of the no prize, I guess, back then. If you read the letters pages in these issues.
So what did you guys think of Namor as a recurring villain for the Fantastic Four here? Not really a usage that we're accustomed to seeing him in the modern context.
His next appearance is one of the most hilarious damn things ever.
I can't wait. I am so excited to talk about that. Yeah. But
I'm for it. Yeah.
I was on board with it because I was like, yeah, this is ridiculous. It's stupid, and I can't get enough of this. Please keep going.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Stan didn't have to do the legwork of creating a brand new villain. He just let's look at the archives and what we can do. And I think the most iconic thing to me is still the shaving of the beard. You see that drop so often, and he looks kind of like Linda Lavin when she dressed up like Robert Goulet. I don't know if you guys saw that episode of Alice. I'm dating myself as ever, but I like Namor's always been a jerk. He a horny for Susan Richards jerk, and I don't know. I've never had an affinity for the character, even though he's the first mutant and he doesn't really fit anywhere.
I don't necessarily buy that retcon.
Okay.
Yeah. So, we just talked about Namor, who kind of became the Fantastic Four's, most frequent recurring villain here in these early issues. But right now we're going to take a break, and when we come back from the break, we're going to talk about the debut of by far the Fantastic Four's most iconic, and perhaps arguably the Marvel Universe in general's most iconic recurring villain. So, hope you're enjoying it thus far. Stick with us through the break, and we will be back right after this.
Promotional consideration paid for by the following.
Hey, pro wrestling announcer Kevin Kelly here. I want to make sure you are all subscribed to all the great feeds here at Place to Be Nation. It's really easy to do. Just head to iTunes or your preferred podcatcher app today and search and subscribe to the Place to Be Nation wrestling feed, which of course includes the full archives of the Kevin Kelly Show, the Place to Be Nation pod feed, and the Pro Wrestling Only feed. Subscribe, listen, and then rate us and leave feedback today. And be sure to give Justin your true thoughts. I mean, don't hold back. After all, he is kind of a jerk. Just listen to Scott.
Place for Nations, JT Rosero and Chad Campbell here. We want to let you know that we have a ton of great podcasts available to you on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and PlaceForNation.com. We offer them to you on two great feeds. On the Place to Be Nation Wrestling feed, we bring you the Mothership, the Place to Be podcast, along with Main Event, Survey Says, the Monday Night Wars, and our monthly pay-per-view reaction show, as well as Jeff Learns Wrestling. In addition to these full-length shows, we also deliver special network podcasts and pod blasts on topics old and new.
Over on the Pro Wrestling Only feed, we dive deep inside the wrestling business with a stacked army of experts leading the way. The feed features potpourri shows such as This Week in Wrestling, Greetings from Allentown, Match of the Week podcast, and the Military Industrial Suplex. We also have shows that focus intently on certain topics like Through the Years, Worldcast, Strong Style History, Strong Style Story, and Mount Olympus. Plus, the feed has the full archives of legendary shows like Titans of Wrestling, Where the Big Boys Play, Letters from Center Stage, and Letters from Kayfabe, plus much more. And on our very popular Place to Be Nation Pop podcast feed, we offer such great shows as Talkin' Pop, the Glenn Butler Podcast Hour Spectacular, NBA Team, PTBN Play, Sunday Groove, Breaking Balls, and Lucha Undead.
As well as a veritable podcast heaven for comics fans.
With the hard-traveling fanboys, Sellers Points, Todd Weber's Conversations, Geek and Sassy, and Marvel Age Podcast.
You can find all of these current shows, plus archives of our past podcasts, including The Kevin Kelly Show, as well by subscribing to both feeds on iTunes. And while there, be sure to rate and leave feedback today. All these shows, plus others, available at PlayStation.com, where we cover pro wrestling, sports, movies, comics, plus in-depth stretch projects, and more. Be sure to support our site by using PlayStation.com/Amazon when doing your online shopping, and download our free PTB Vintage Vault Refresh ebooks via the links on our site. We also want to thank our friends at Boneheads, Wing Bar in West Warwick, Rhode Island, and Fall River, Massachusetts, and historyofwrestling.com. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr as well. PlayStationNation.com, the only place to be in your pop culture world.
Meet the sulky, over-bulky, kinda hulky superhero. A two-fisted and electrically transistored superhero. An exotically neurotic and aquatic superhero. The Marvel superheroes have arrived. Superpowered from the forehead to the toes. Watch them change their very shape before your nose. See a cane-striking superhero change to Viking superhero. A humdinging, real swinging, shield-flinging superhero. They're the latest, they're the greatest, ultimatest superheroes. The Marvel superheroes have arrived.
And welcome back, dear listeners of Place to Be Nation, to the Marvel Age podcast, featuring, I think we've decided to dub ourselves the Sarcastic Four, trademark of the manager, Todd Weber, on that one. He came up with the name, so all due credit to him. And it's just occurred to me during the break that Greg is going to listen to this and hear me hosting a show and be wondering why I've only hosted one in 107 episodes of our show. And the answer is, because I just didn't fucking feel like it. So, before the break, we teased that when we came back, we were going to get into the debut of arguably the most iconic villain in the Marvel Universe, that, of course, being in Fantastic Four #5 back in July of 1962. We see the debut of Victor Von Doom. Once again, Stan Lee, Jack Kirby creation. And I really enjoyed this issue, guys. I loved the opening scene of this issue. You see Dr. Doom playing with like Fantastic Four pieces on a checkerboard. Strangely not a chessboard for some reason. That was a little weird. So I don't know if they necessarily got across the, the mental, the psychological warfare aspect that would have been implied by mental chess. But nonetheless, the design of this character, retelling his version of Doom's origin that would later be fleshed out, from what I understand. Doom's plot, the debut of the Doombots, a wacky time travel subplot thrown in there on top of this. I don't know, man. All of this worked for me. What did you guys think?
This was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Especially because I'm with you. Dr. Doom is like the iconic Marvel villain. So this being his first appearance, and
is it weird to say? And I say this without trying to upset Tim, but is it weird to say that I'm almost more excited about the inclusion of Dr. Doom in the MCU if the Fox deal goes through than I am the inclusion of the X-Men in the MCU?
Clutching my pearls.
Tim is like fanning himself at the moment, trying to keep from fainting. But I'm kind of with you there, actually, because we've had some good X-Men movies. I've seen X-Men, but I've never seen a good portrayal of Dr. Doom.
Exactly.
So I'm still waiting on that to happen. But one other thing that does happen in this issue, and I'm just going to call it out every time that Stan Lee throws in his fourth wall breaking self-referential bullshit, is Johnny Storm reading Hulk #1.
Yep.
Right on
still
panel.
Pumping up the Hulk.
Yep, he's still
They tried.
He's still reading it, and because at this point these characters don't exist in the same universe.
No.
They
not
are
necessarily.
They are apart from each other. The idea of all of this being part of the same world has not occurred to anyone yet. So not even the people creating the books.
And I also wanted to ask you guys this. This is the debut, to my understanding, having not read FF number 3, Tim, so fill me in if I'm wrong. This is the first time we will see several examples of asbestos being used as a weapon to take down Johnny Storm. And I'm just wondering, how many characters in the Fantastic Four mythos do we think have mesothelioma at this point?
Okay. I'm glad you pointed this out, because do you remember that miniseries from about, probably 10 years ago or more now? What was it called? Basically where Mary Jane was dying because Peter Parker had pumped her with too much radioactive web fluid. You know?
Yeah.
No, I do not remember this miniseries.
It's called Spider-Man Reign.
Okay.
I think. There has to be a companion to this where the Human Torch is dying of mesothelioma.
Right. I mean,
because my God, it really is such a recurring motif in this. How many years did this go on? You know, like
just asbestos. Yeah,
we've got to keep a tally, I think.
And the villains must just keep a metric ton of the stuff on hand to weave into webs or to line walls with or whatever they do. I mean, there's probably just like, I'm thinking there's an entire like warehouse at Castle Doom devoted to just asbestos stores.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There might be, as best as we can tell.
But no, all this is fun, man, and like the origin I really dug. Todd,
6 panels.
Yep.
Dr. Doom's one-page origin. That's all you need.
Yeah, I mean, why spend an exuberant amount of time on it whenever you can just like cut right to the point? He mixed sorcery and science together and found a way to do it. Scarred himself horribly and wears a giant metal mask and is obsessed with Reed and Sue Richards. There you go.
Now, they don't have anything about his mom. That was stuff that was later retconned.
Yeah, retconned in, yep.
But,
and you know, it's one of those things where, not to get too technical about it, but it is a retcon, but it's not so much changing something you thought you already knew. It's just adding,
right.
Just adding some shading to what we already knew.
Right.
Which,
I love this story. I the fact that he makes expressions through his metal mask.
Oh yeah.
There's coloring foibles all throughout this issue. It's got flesh-colored hands on the splash page. He's got a pet tiger that we never see again.
It's never explained how he has a castle. Like, the idea of him being the ruler of Latveria is not even mentioned here in this. He just has a castle, somewhere that is implied to be vaguely European. So, all very, very interesting. And, this issue would be notable if it were just a Doctor Doom origin, but then they work in this really odd time travel subplot where they reveal that the Thing is actually Blackbeard. It's like...
In hilarious fashion,
yes.
By the way. It is...
I think we kind of buried the lead here.
Yes.
The Thing is fucking Blackbeard the pirate.
Yes. All that history, all those stories of Blackbeard the pirate, and this comic is going to imply that it was Ben Grimm, and it was just this one time.
Yeah. Von Doom has created this time machine. All he wants is treasure. He's not going to go back and repair his face or anything like that.
Well, he wants the magical gems of Merlin that could give him the power.
Stones.
Yes, essentially.
Yes, this is the Infinity Stones before the Infinity Stones were a thing.
Yes, pretty much. He wants the magical gems of Merlin, which can grant him the power to take over the world or something like that, I think is the implication.
I got to give the story a little bit of credit here, though, because at first I thought I bid on the idea that this might be a get-rich-quick scheme. I was like, is Dr. Doom really asking them to go back and steal precious jewels when it might be easier to just do it in modern day? Why all this elaborate ruse? What is all this? And then when it turns out that no, all that stuff that I told you about at the beginning about him combining sorcery with science continues to play a very important aspect of his character throughout this issue and actually throughout his entire character history. So that they established that's his motivations right here at the beginning, I was actually really on board for. So as silly as it was, they had me.
You're right. That does work in a way that a get-rich-quick scheme would not. And
it's just they've done that already.
They have. And I don't know.
We'd already seen it, and I didn't want a character like Dr. Doom to be ever, at any point in his history, to be relegated to something like that. And I was glad to see that even back then, even at the beginnings of Dr. Doom, that was not really going to ever wind up being the case. Although he is fairly easily fooled here by Reed Richards, it seems. He's like, well, okay, we brought you back Blackbeard's chest. This is totally what you asked for. Open it up. chains, curses.
Yeah, it is a little weird. He throws them into this situation that he has no control over and is just trusting that they're going to do what he has told them to do.
Totally trusting them, not monitoring them to see if they've succeeded. No. He's just decided that, I guess that was enough time for them to have gone over there and done that. I've had a couple of meals. I've had a couple of meals. I fondled his wife.
Yeah, I was supposed to say another example of Susan Storm being like taken. The implication is that there's some sort of sexual fascination on the part of Victor Von Doom, at least that I took anyway.
There's not, but not less than a little bit of misogyny going on in these issues.
Right.
But she does kind of save the day at the end, though.
She does.
It's a little moment.
I mean, Sue gets her moment, as she tends to, but she also seems to be the damsel in distress in at least every issue.
She does, but I don't know. Not that it's excusable, but I give it a little bit more credit than being the total damsel in distress trope. It's like a 0.5 Silver Age sexism versus 1.0 Silver Age sexism,
Yeah.
Oh, sure. It's not nearly as bad as other titles of its day, or even some, across the way at the competition. But but it's still there. You can tell that this is another one of those things about these issues. It makes them appear as they are, as products of their time. That's what they are. It's the early 60s, folks.
I think Stan's finding Ben's voice a little bit more here.
Yeah, getting there.
You get more of the classic thing, mannerisms and back talk, and not necessarily antagonistic or more just annoyed with things here and there. And my favorite is he says "bah" yet again, but but they don't pay off for also rans. That may be.
Yeah,
I don't understand the context of that.
I think "bah" is the early "it's clobbering time." It might as well be his catchphrase because he drops it in what seems like every issue.
You also get the kind of rivalry between he and the Human Torch, which really started in probably issue 3, which we didn't talk about, but continues over into issue 4 and will play out throughout this entire run. And it kind of develops and matures, whereas it's not just a situation where it's Ben Grimm being completely unhinged, as we saw in his initial appearance, because these stories are, I don't know if you all picked up on this or noticed, pretty Human Torch centric. It felt like.
Well, it felt like, a book that was kind of being written for a younger audience, and so you kind of want I think the intention was that the younger character was kind of the four. He's the POV character, Yeah,
that's what I was saying. He's who we're supposed to view these events through the eyes of, and you've got the older, like aloof, like very intelligent and wise, but kind of not really privy to your plight character in Mr. Fantastic.
Yeah.
You bossy. Got super, bossy, and even like I would say even a little over borderline abusive uncle in Ben Grimm.
Mm-hmm.
And then the somewhat overbearing and yet out of touch older sister. So
she's a society chick. It's
very much
established pretty early on. She's kind of rich, and I don't know. I was never really clear on how rich she was supposed to be, but in any case, the point is that modern readers today, I feel like, look at the Fantastic Four and go, well, the Thing is really the heart and soul of that team, right? And that's how it's supposed to function. Like, you can't really have a Fantastic Four without him. And he was very touch and go in these early issues.
In the early going, I think the actual idea was to make Johnny Storm that.
I do too. Yeah,
they were steering into that kind of hard, but I think maybe readership influence, or maybe just Stan and Jack feeling like, this Thing character doesn't need to be such an asshole all the time.
Yeah.
We need someone who's kind of, gruff yet lovable, and he's got the gruff side down pretty well, but he ain't lovable.
And let's face it, there's a tragedy to this character, and yet we're writing him in a way that is so unlikable.
Yeah, that's another thing.
Why don't we lean into that?
Hey, there's a plot point we haven't really touched on. How about the glimmer of hope they keep giving Ben Grimm over and over again?
Yeah.
In pretty much every issue here early on, even though we all know now he's never going to get that for any extended period of time. It was like they were teasing out that possible cure years in advance,
Kicking a man when he's down, yeah.
And that's part of when you start to feel like you feel bad for him, but just as you start to feel bad for him, he does something that really turns that back the other way, where you're like, you know what, you're still a piece of shit.
If we had gotten thought balloons from him where he said, I'm only this way because I'm hurt, I can't share that.
Mm-hmm.
We're supposed to kind of infer that that's happening. Because he's written almost irredeemably at times, but every issue he has this yanked out from under him. Mm-hmm. So if they had just had an inner monologue going on for him, where you could just say, I mustn't let anybody get close. I need to be a monster inside to match my exterior. Mm-hmm. I think it could have worked. There's a no prize.
But But as the history of the Fantastic Four goes along, he becomes the lovable Thing that we all know and appreciate.
And this earlier characterization does hold up under that lens. I think you can retroactively, as Todd described, sort of smooth it over. And also, Todd, to your point, it is coming along here issue by issue, where you're getting more of Ben Grimm proper. So, this is, still a little bit rough feeling things out with Fantastic Four, but, you get their iconic, who, by the way, Dr. Doom does not have his full cloak.
No.
He has the cowl, but he doesn't really have the cape draped over his entire body.
And I think we continue to talk about how, I think because that first issue was so reined in from Jack, pretty much every issue of Jack art that we see here, I think, gets progressively better and better. Would you guys agree?
Yeah. Well, like that book says, the numbers were coming back, sales numbers were coming back, and so he was given maybe a little bit more motivation. He's like, all right, this is going to be seen by more people. I'm going to get to put more of myself into this. It's going to stick around for a bit, so I'm not, there's no motivation for me to just kind of phone it in if this is something I'm going to invest more of my creativity into. I like that cover is so iconic to me. You have all four characters using their powers, but you have a green masked Doctor.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't understand what. Yeah, that's a little weird for sure, but you know,
I think
just communicate down.
Could that have been just kind of a coloring error? Because you figure Doctor Doom is supposed to be, I don't know, sort of Battleship gray in the color palette that they had at the time. The Hulk, of course, also is gray, but seemed to be sort of miscolored or shaded more in a green tone, and even in that first issue that we looked at. So I don't know if this was maybe a little bit deliberate or partially an overcorrection, but yeah, that whole gray-green scale thing is a little bit muddy in 60s Marvel Comics.
Agreed. But we talked a little bit about Jack Kirby, improving steadily. So why don't we go ahead and move over to, for my money anyway, kind of where he hits his zenith, at least during this publishing year. And let's talk about some Journey into Mystery, fellas, where on this, for whatever reason, on this countdown that we're reading, Journey into Mystery issues 83 and 85 were listed as one entry without 84. Again, I don't know why that is, but let's go ahead and delve into that.
I think I know why that is, but yeah.
Well, you can probably tell us, because I think you actually read some of these missing issues, did you not, Tim?
Yeah, I mean, I did go ahead and read Journey into Mystery 84, and it's just, while it does introduce Jane Foster, there's just not a lot to it. It's still that we're kind of between knowing what Thor is and what he's supposed to be. Mm-hmm. So it feels quite inessential. It is a very one-and-done type of story. Granted, I did like it a lot, but it does make sense for that to be left off the list, because you have in 83 basically the origin of Thor / Don Blake, and then in 85 you have kind of the origin of Loki and all of this sort of backstory introduced.
Right. So as Tim said there, in 83 we get the Donald Blake version of the origin story, with a guy who is on vacation, encounters the Stone Men from Saturn, who, by the way, one of them was featured in the opening scene of Thor: The Dark World, when Thor takes down a big rock creature at the beginning, in a nice callback to Journey into Mystery 83.
Love your Thor food.
He, winds up coming across this cave, finding the cane within, tapping it on the ground, and you get what's kind of funny to me here is once he becomes Thor, you get him experimenting with the cane here and finding out these very specific rules that they lay out in issue 83 that, as someone who's read virtually every appearance of Thor ever, up to at least the modern age, I don't know that these rules, at least in these specific contexts, ever come into play ever again. But Stan makes a point to write in there of stamp the handle on the ground twice and you can create rain or snow. Stamp it on the ground 3 times and it turns off the storm. But to only stamp it once and he turns back into Don Blake. And so I don't know that the double stamp or the triple stamp even ever actually was brought up ever again. But
it's a little difficult there. How long do you wait between hits before?
Yeah, but
okay.
I was trying to create a storm, and I turned myself back into myself.
I turned myself back into the lame, as they refer to him over and over again, the lame Donald Blake.
Lame Donald Blake. Okay, a lot of things here. So I was reading this somewhat closely because they get so specific with these rules. It's quite interesting.
Right.
I think actually the stamp it once, we see that in issue 85 where he actually hits not the handle of the hammer on the ground, but the sort of mallet portion itself, and that's what transforms him. So I almost wonder if it's a directional type of specificity. But in any case, I did think this whole origin segment, while it is kind of exposition heavy, it is bouncy and entertaining to watch play out because of Kirby's renderings here, which are on full display.
Yes.
And by far, I think, is the best example of this is Jack Kirby.
Yeah, like, they don't get to get into it a lot here in 83, and we're going to discuss 85 here a little bit, but you almost get the feeling that Kirby wanted to do cosmic more than anything else he ever wanted to do. And when Thor came along, it was like it was serving this guy a big plate of red meat that he just absolutely ate up. So, Todd, I know we haven't heard your thoughts on 83 here just yet.
Just a couple things. First off, this is a 14-page story, right? So
right.
There's got to be more B-stock or short stories in there, fantasy-based short stories that were not part of the reprint in MU, at least.
Yeah, if you're reading on Marvel Unlimited, you will see that this one, and I think we're going to run into several other issues during the course of this project, that if you're reading on Marvel Unlimited, will be like this, where they're only kind of printing or recreating the historically relevant portion. So here for Journey into Mystery, which like a Amazing Adult Fantasy or a Tales to Astonish at the time was an anthology book, we're only getting the 14-page Thor story recreated in the digital format.
Everyone, if you have the MU app, click on the more information or view issue details for this issue and click the creators.
Okay, I'm going there myself.
What do you see?
Penciler Jack Kirby, editor Stan Lee, inker Joe Sinnott, penciler Don Heck, penciler Steve Ditko, writer Larry Lieber. Interesting.
I do not have Jack Kirby listed as a creator in the interior.
That's a good point.
Sure looks like a lot of Jack Kirby isms in there.
It had to have been Kirby.
Not.
You know.
I think Don Heck did some of the, I'm calling them backup stories, but other.
Right.
Let me actually look, because.
And Ditko's listed as well. But at least in MU. So I'm just pointing out perhaps an error in MU. Thirdly, this is written as though Don Blake is Thor and has Thor has Don Blake's personality, much like Captain Marvel, Shazam. So eventually we will get. We have no Shakespearean Asgardian language yet,
but we will get there.
We have just. Oh yeah, I mean, they're again origin story. Thor's belt is very keen. I do like this quite a bit. The art is great. The story is great. But all these little rules about the hammer and the personality thing is a little interesting to me.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So yeah, he basically winds up foiling or defeating the stone men from Saturn, and this issue kind of ends off with a. They drop a tease for the next issue. Actually, I thought this was kind of cool. You know, a lot of these books end with teases for the next issue, but this one is actually written on the side of Mjolnir, and they misspell Thor's name, calling him Thor with 2 R's, which I thought was interesting.
We will see more.
I did miss that.
I saw that too, but we will see more of that with a hero we're going to be introduced to in short order.
Yeah.
But I really enjoyed this issue. I do have one question for you guys.
Yeah.
Now, in a world without a Fantastic Four and without a Thor, what if the Stone Men of Saturn and the Skrulls had invaded the Earth as they intended in these stories? They would have arrived kind of simultaneously, I feel like. And what would that look like? That Earth that is being simultaneously invaded by these alien interlopers. I mean, who you got in that fight?
I'll probably take the Skrulls, because you get the implication they have an entire empire, whereas the Stonemen from Saturn, there's like 5 of them, and they don't seem like they're the brightest crayons in the box, so to speak.
Right. Thor,
they're a little dull around the edges.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Thor not only defeats them, he does so handily.
Whoops that ass. So
whoops that ass.
Single-handedly.
Yes.
That's right.
So, yeah, go ahead, Russell.
Way to hammer it home, Russell.
Yep. I'm gonna throw in. I'm gonna throw in the bad puns when I can. Why not? The art, as you guys pointed out, this is my favorite Kirby art of all the issues that we read.
I'm gonna disagree with you there, but only because we're about to talk about the next one. Let's go ahead.
Well, this and the next one.
Yes.
Yeah, 83 and 85.
83 and 85, yep.
Yeah, 83 and 85 are my favorite Kirby art of all the books we read, especially whenever we get into the next issue. We're talking about Asgard and seeing all of that. I thought that was absolutely tremendous, and that's where Kirby really starts to sing. And in a full-throated performance, too. It is absolutely amazing. The writing on this, the rules of the hammer notwithstanding being a little exposition heavy, I actually kind of dug the final fight scene between Thor and the Stone Men as they're throwing up like hallucination stuff to throw off fighter pilots. Thor's not fooled by any of this and just kind of goes right through them. And that's what I like to see out of my Thor. I like to see this dude swinging a hammer and wrecking shop. That's what I want. And it seems like from the very beginning, Jack Kirby and I are kind of on the same page. I feel like he draws a Thor and presents him in a way that makes the most sense to me, or makes sense to me in the way that I prefer to see Thor presented, even if it is really, really fucking weird to read him in a normal person voice rather than speaking in his Asgardian Shakespearean way that I'm more used to.
Right.
That part still throws me a little bit because it's like, all right, well, basically what's happened here is Don Blake has just been imbued with the power of Thor, but is not himself Thor.
And like I said, there's only one other issue, the issue immediately after this, where you have that kind of setup where it's Thor but devoid of the trappings you would come to expect with Asgard and everything else. It's just basically Thor dropped into an otherwise fairly conventional superhero story, got kind of boilerplate villains in the form of the Stone Men from Saturn, and then in 84, it's this guy called the Executioner, not to be confused with the Asgardian.
Did anyone pick up on the only named Stone Man from Saturn?
I guess I did not.
The only named Stone Man from Saturn was named Gore with 2 R's.
Oh God, I did notice that, and I'm glad that you picked that out. God, I forgot about that. But yeah, that was a pretty cool thing, and I'm hoping that that's where Jason Aaron came with the name.
Absolutely had to be. I knowing Jason Aaron and his sensibilities, it absolutely had to be where he lifted the name of Gore the God Butcher. But we've made reference to Journey into Mystery 85, so let's go ahead and address this one real quick, even though it's jumping around a little bit of our chronology because it's counted as one story on our listing. This for me, guys, not to spoil anything before we give our final thoughts on the year at the end of the podcast, but this is my favorite issue that we read. I thought, even though it's only 14 pages, here you begin to see the initial introductions of all the elements that are going to make Thor completely distinct from every other character in the Marvel Universe. We see the Rainbow Bridge, we see Asgard, we get first appearances of Heimdall, Loki, and Odin, and I think even Balder pops up at the very end as well. They are already fleshing out this mythology. They are giving you the Thor-Loki feud as we know it, and they are also implying that this very much takes place, in the continuity of classic Norse mythology. As you have at the open of the issue, Loki is already imprisoned for something that he has previously done. So you get the implication of this overarching centuries-long feud between Thor and Loki that we're just now being privy to as readers of Marvel Comics. So, guys, hit me up on issue 85. Did you guys wind up loving this as much as I did?
I love that we established this mythology this early on in Thor's appearances, because the initial in 83 hinted that he could have just gone the standard superhero route, that we didn't have to see all this stuff. But in 85, it's like, no, we're going to fully introduce all these ideas about, Norse mythology being a real thing in our universe, where if we're going to tell this story, we're going to bring in all these different elements. And seeing Heimdall, seeing Odin, seeing like the friggin' Rainbow Bridge, like all this stuff, it's all there. Yep. This is the mythology that that if you knew anything about Norse mythology, it's all there. They're bringing it all in. That the whole Loki being trapped in a tree thing, I thought that was rendered really well.
It was, yep.
And using his cunning to get out of that situation.
Mm-hmm.
Getting out on a technicality.
Yep, love it.
He's like, I didn't make this person cry by telling them my story. He's like, I hit him in the face with a leaf.
Mm-hmm.
But
it counts.
Yeah, he was like, he shed a tear, didn't he? He let me out.
That's how it's supposed to work. So yep.
Getting off on a technicality, and that'll be Loki's. That's the theme of Loki's very existence. Mm-hmm. Getting off on the technicality. I really dug that. I really dug the first, I guess, quote unquote, first meeting of Thor and Loki, where Thor only recognizes him because he's familiar with Norse mythology.
Mm-hmm.
Not because he actually had memories of Loki.
Right, because they have not yet gotten into like I think it was Tim or Todd, somebody earlier mentioned the fact that we haven't yet reached that point where they are treating as Thor and Donald Blake as distinct personalities. We will get there at some point, and for my money, I think that's when the book really starts to sing a little bit. But yeah,
so very eager to see when that happens.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Tim.
Sorry, I'm very eager to see when that actually happens.
It's not that far in based on my memory. I think we're about 2 years away from it, if I recall correctly.
Okay. Yeah, I have not read much
to me
of early Thor. Go ahead, Todd.
This reads like people like the concept and responded to issue 83. So Jack and Stan went to the library and checked out some books on Norse mythology.
Mm-hmm.
Which is fine, though. Like, I mean, it is still at that point where they're trying to fit stuff in, and as they go along, they make it more the Marvel version of Norse mythology as opposed to trying to just do Norse mythology.
Yeah, which, if you've read the contemporary Neil Gaiman book on Norse mythology, there's some crazy shit going there. Panel of the book for me is Loki saying, "Be gone, pigeons."
Yes, when he sends the pigeons at Thor, I was expecting, like, we see Thor spinning his hammer and hurling the hammer. We never actually see any of the fallout of that from it being thrown into a cloud of pigeons. And I'm imagining, like, Randy Johnson throwing the ball and it hitting a bird, just like feathers flying everywhere. Like, just a storm of feathers going up in the air and Thor murdering hundreds of pigeons. But that's not the direction they chose to go. But, yeah, so you get here all throughout this fight with Loki and Thor, which kind of takes up the majority of this 14-page story. It's Loki using his cunning and his magic and his trickery because he knows he's physically outmatched. And even from the very beginning, they pretty much have that dynamic where one-on-one from a physical standpoint, Loki is no match, so he's using trickery. And I love the fact that they get across his character and his personality through the fight scene. Yeah, like I said, I've gushed about this one enough. You guys have any more thoughts on Journey into Mystery 85 before we move on?
Well, we do meet Odin for the first time.
We do, yep.
We do when Loki lands back in Asgard, and we don't, it's kind of well done. We don't see a lot of lightning yet associated with Thor's power.
Not yet, no, though we've not gotten there.
Hammer's just kind of a blunt force that comes back to him, but yeah, still dynamic. Definitely a lot of work went into this story, and Loki is going to just get more and more twisted and clever as things go. So important that they established him, and we see him again next year, I think, in Avengers, if not sooner.
Yeah, and you mentioned Odin. The narration also calls out Balder and Tyr as also making their debuts here. So I think that's kind of cool. So we get Odin, Balder, Tyr, Heimdall, and Loki all making their first appearances in one 14-page story. So like Todd said, it's almost like Stan and Jack were just going, okay, what Norse mythological concepts can we reach for and put in here? So, yeah, I was a big fan of this.
I had two kind of quick hits on this, which to Todd's point about establishing sort of the powers or lack thereof of Thor and the hammer, we see at one point here, which is somewhat interesting to me, I don't know how you guys felt about it, Don Blake manipulating the hammer without actually transforming into Thor. So he has transformed back to Don Blake, which has broken the spell that, again, it's hypnotism, right? Or hypnotism, however it's spelled in this issue, to break the spell that Loki has cast over Thor. So it's Don Blake now. He's realizing what's going on. And the hammer is still the hammer, right? It's not the cane or the walking stick or whatever that we associate with civilian Don Blake. So while it is still the hammer, he's kind of manipulating it and summoning storms and whatnot without fully transforming into Thor. So I don't know. I guess we'll see how that evolves maybe as this series goes on.
Yeah, they're definitely playing fast and loose with the rules early on.
A little bit. But haven't really broken any established rules yet to my recollection or knowledge. So I'm kind of okay with it. And then the other thing is we get like a tour of New York City in this issue.
Yeah, we do. You're right.
We go we're in Times Square. We're at the Empire State Building, which gets name checked. And I mean, it's been established that the Fantastic Four are based out of New York. So it's kind of like, again, we're not saying that these take place within the same universe yet, but we're also not saying that they aren't. Nothing has contradicted anything within these different titles and these different characters, so we're kind of getting there and teasing at that shared universe concept. But yeah, I mean, I love this issue, I think, as much as you guys did, so very much looking forward to the progression of Thor and Journey into Mystery as we continue this series.
3 quick things. We do see Jane. I don't know if we mentioned Jane is here.
Yeah, I think Tim mentioned he read 84 that featured Jane's introduction. So
it did, and it was very ableist. It was a very ableist kind of thing where it was like, oh, I could never love my nurse Jane Foster, which again is problematic for other reasons, but it's like, because I am so lame, she could never see me as a man, and she's all like, if he could only embrace me.
And in future years, we will see this exact same subplot repeated with Karen Page and Matt Murdock when we get into future episodes of the show.
Yes.
I mean, it's literally the same thing, so.
Sorry, Todd.
I can hear Greg throwing the
it's good.
across the room already.
She's not referred to by name. We also have civilian Loki, which I thought was kind of cool.
That was cool.
With the fedora, who looked
Yep.
A little bit like Namor.
I'm glad you brought that moment up, because that actually reminded me of Loki's first appearance in the first Avengers film. When he's
in a green suit.
Yeah, when he's walking amongst people, and
or even his appearance when Thor is in the holding cell in the first Thor movie at the S.H.I.E.L.D. facility, and he pops up there. He also has a very similar look as well.
It's just his demeanor, like as he's observing people to begin with, and then he just drops the whole facade because he stops caring.
Yep.
I really dug that bit about Loki, and was glad to see that is something that has been part of his character from the very first appearance.
Yep. So yeah,
if you read the text boxes, real quick on this, the text boxes do not read very much of Stan's hyperbole and gift. It's very, very descriptive and just kind of to the point instead of selling things a little bit more.
I hate this. I mean, like, you don't want to make these assumptions or try to give one collaborator credit over the other, but does it not feel like early Thor is more of a Jack creation than a Stan creation?
It feels more focused, and like Todd was saying, everything feels more to the point rather than trying to sell us on something. So yeah, actually, I think that's a mark of Kirby far more than it is of Lee.
Right.
So when you're reading stuff like that that's something to absolutely keep in mind, and I think we'll see it again coming up in another issue that we're going to talk about a little bit later. But I can go ahead and say definitively that it was the issue I maybe liked the least of all the ones we read.
Well, I think it's safe to say that Thor is Kirby's favorite child.
Sure.
With his original Marvel Silver Age superhero creations. And that shows some of these early Journey into Mystery Thor stories, I think, were scripted by Larry Lieber.
Yes, Larry Lieber is the proper credited, at least the scripter on...
Scripter.
As far as like...
Or whatever that entails at the time, right? It's a little bit... And this is the thing, we've kind of danced around a little bit. Like, the reason the credits and the recollections of these things are so hazy, it's not so much just us and lack of research, it's that these were...
But it's a little bit of that, too.
It is a little bit of that, yes, but this was all intended to be disposable children's entertainment. So none of these creators at the time thought that they were working on anything that would have some kind of continued lasting cultural relevance all these decades later. So it wasn't important to them to remember who was doing what and to care about things like, well, there's a plot hole in this issue of Fantastic. Like, it didn't matter. It didn't matter.
And it still really doesn't. It's one of those things that you've seen. We can actually call this out throughout history without getting too deep here. It's like, man, we were just trying to write stories that, we felt we needed to tell. We weren't expecting you guys to build a religion around it.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think we've kind of hit most of the high points about this Journey into Mystery stuff. I'm glad to hear that
Does Todd have anything else? I know we kind of
I don't. I'm good.
Okay. I gotta say though, I was glad to hear that. I knew coming into this project that this was going to be the high point for me, being the massive Thor fan that I am. I'm happy to hear that it had a positive influence on you guys as well, even though you don't necessarily have the deep connection to the character that I had coming into this project. So good to hear on that front. But let's move on to our next story that we read here, and I think this is arguably. I don't know, what would you guys say? Fantastic Four #1 or this in terms of the most iconic story that we read here? I would kind of lean this, I would think.
This.
Yeah.
This is going to be my one because it's no secret that Spider-Man is my all-time favorite character.
Right.
And I've read Amazing Fantasy 15 before, and this is going to be my continued hot take on this issue. This does not read like the origin of a superhero. It reads like the origin of a supervillain.
Yep. Right. I don't think that's a hot take. I thought the same thing. I don't know when I came to that kind of conclusion, but it was sort of floating around in my mind and really was reinforced by this rereading. So,
and it's funny to hear Stan Lee retell the story of of what he was trying to accomplish by creating a character like Spider-Man.
Mm-hmm.
But whenever I hear him tell that story and then I read the issue, I'm like, Stan, you're so full of shit. You've practiced the retelling of that, of saying, oh, I was trying to create a character that was, a teenager, but he's not a sidekick. I wanted teenagers to feel like they could see themselves as the heroes of these stories. And I'm like, well, Peter Parker he's a real bitch. In this story.
Well, I don't know that I would go that far.
Well,
yeah, he's real. He's
put that on in a way
he loves those old people.
Well, that's my point. It's not supervillain. It's not the story of It's not a supervillain origin of this era of the 1960s.
Right.
But if you put this in the modern context, this reads like a modern supervillain origin.
It's the one bad day that every supervillain, every great kind of supervillain has, where it's one of those situations where it's a morality story, right? But it is so disproportionately weighted against the protagonist in a way that almost makes you go, wait a minute, fuck that. Like, he didn't really do anything wrong in a way, but he was so, again, disproportionately punished for his crime that you're sort of like, if he had turned to villainy, he would be one of those very almost sympathetic supervillains, right?
Gray area. Yeah.
That's what I mean, is that he, in the modern context, that's exactly what this version of the character
That's
would
what
have
you
become.
do with the supervillain today. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like, this is the archetype of the supervillain. And as you're reading this story, he's even saying at times that he's going to get back at these kids who have wronged him. And I kind of felt like, man, if it hadn't been for Uncle Ben dying, I really feel like you would have gotten bored with the whole like fame and fortune thing, and eventually you would have started taking out your frustrations and anger on those kids who wronged you, and who knows what you would have done.
Mm-hmm. Or you would have taken the wrong lesson from what actually happened.
Yeah, or it could have gone the exact other way, but the idea of power and responsibility are introduced in the very end of this story. Or at least at the end of the Spider-Man story, because there's more to Amazing Fantasy 15 than just the Spider-Man story. It's only one part of a larger whole, and I got to tell you, that larger whole largely sucks.
Yeah, we're going to encounter this a couple of times throughout this podcast where there are things on our list that are longer than what is relevant, and so for the purposes of this discussion, I think we're going to restrict it to what's relevant. And what's relevant here is the first 11 pages of the story, where, yes, the entire Spider-Man origin plays out over the first 11 pages of Amazing Fantasy 15 by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. And it opens, we see Peter Parker's a guy who's being picked on, he's got rough luck. We then see Uncle Ben coming up behind Peter Parker and tickling him awake as Peter Parker is sleeping on his stomach, so there are all sorts of unpleasant implications there.
Okay.
We let's just call it like it is. Like they're,
all right.
What? No, Tim, if you have thoughts, I mean.
there
See,
are.
all you have to do is put quotes around the word uncle.
Yes, Uncle Ben. Then you get Aunt May, who has her eyes so squinted she looks like Mr. Magoo, because she's so
Both
fucking.
of them kind of do.
Yeah.
It's just from all the dust.
And she's also cooking his favorite breakfast, which of course is wheat cakes.
Wheat cakes!
All right. Okay, can we stop for a second? Are wheat cakes a thing?
I assume they're pancakes, right?
That's what I thought. I was like,
is that just like a 60s colloquialism? Because I have
no idea.
never in my life heard of
maybe
wheat
it's
cakes outside of Spider-Man comics.
Maybe judging by this artistic interpretation of Aunt May, it's an 1860s colloquialism, because
I mean,
from the jump, this bitch looks like she could keel over at any moment and die. She's so hunched over, she looks like she's developing scoliosis to a certain degree. Like, it just... I do not know how they've ever kept her alive for this long. It is bizarre, but...
Oh, they are in their 90s minimum.
90s, yes, exactly. So yeah, we see the...
Before we get too heavy there, I do want to call out that the Steve Ditko art here is really great.
Oh, it's awesome, yes.
I'm a huge fan of the look of this issue and Ditko's designs of Spider-Man.
I would agree with all of that. You see Petey, he's going through hard shit at the beginning where kids are picking on him. You get the spider bite, you get him discovering his powers, and you're pretty quickly into the wrestling aspect of this origin that we all know and love, that was depicted in the first Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie.
With a little Crusher Hogan in this story instead of no Bonesaw to be found here.
No, Crusher Hogan being the OG. Petey making the Spider-Man costume for himself, going on something of a television career, I guess, here is what the implication is.
Yeah, he was doing a sideshow type deal on TV and getting paid per appearance, and that's when he's not being underpaid or anything. At least that's not the implication of the issue, as it was in like other retellings of this origin, that he felt like he was being undercut. So whenever the guys are robbed by this dude, he's just not caring. In this, it's very much he just didn't give a shit.
Yeah.
And didn't want to.
He had been picked on so much throughout his life that he had decided from here on out he was only going to look out for number one. And when this thief comes running by, he's just like, you know what, man, screw it. You get the classic reveal that it's he goes home, his uncle's been murdered by the same guy. He eventually tracks him down.
But not that night.
Right.
It's a completely different day whenever this happens. Every other telling of that origin, it has it happen all in the same night. This, Pete goes home, and his aunt and uncle present him with a brand new microscope, and he's actually got. This is the moment where you're like, as much of a whiny little prick as you are towards these kids who picked on you. Mm-hmm. In this moment, he shows that real human side of him that says he genuinely loves these two people. Mm-hmm. So I totally bought in at that point. I'm like, all right,
same.
You are definitely a genuinely good nephew to your aunt and uncle.
One thing
and you don't really blame him for being like. At first, he does say, "Hey, I'm in it for myself. I'm looking out for number one." But given his treatment up to this point, you're kind of like, "Yeah, fuck everybody else." But then to see him acknowledge, okay, my aunt and uncle have really doted on me and have cared so much and provided for me, I'm going to take care of them too. You're like, yeah, okay, I'm on board with this, right? He's kind of doing right by them, even if he's saying screw the rest of the world, and almost deservedly so. You could say it's a somewhat objectivist philosophy here that he is espousing.
Which, I'm sure we will delve into that as we cover, in subsequent episodes.
Imagine
some of the later stuff that Steve Ditko would start to work into this book. One thing I wanted to call out that I just literally noticed, if you guys have it on Marvel Unlimited, the scene where he finally has the thief by the neck or whatever, on the very last page of this story, is the only time pupils in the Spider-Man mask, which I did not even catch, but my God, is it off-putting now that I've seen it. Because it does not look anything like Spider-Man that I know and love,
I think they hadn't quite figured out that he should adjust the eyes on the mask.
Mm-hmm. Well, they didn't have pupils in. I just looked through the book real quick. I didn't see pupils in any other panel whenever he was in costume.
What I mean is that when you see Spider-Man in the modern context, if they want to show emotion on the face of the mask, they'll change the mask.
They'll
change the eyes. They'll adjust the eyes.
Don't give him pupils.
They don't give it pupils, but notice that Steve Ditko doesn't do that here.
Yeah, it's all.
He does not, at any point in the story, he doesn't change the eyes of the mask to have shown that level of emotion. It's all pretty much the same. But here he wanted to show that, and I guess it didn't occur to him to adjust the eyes instead of adding pupils. And the pupils make it look like super weird and creepy.
Mm-hmm. And here's something that may surprise you guys, being, that I'm the Thor mark that I am, but this Steve Ditko classic costume design, it's easily the best costume design we've seen in this year that we read, right? Covering the 61, 62 era. I mean, it's incredible. It's incredible.
Isn't there some debate over who actually designed the costume?
It's a Kirby cover, but a Ditko
right. That's one thing that was interesting is, I think Todd and I can talk about this a little bit. You have this iconic cover to Amazing Fantasy 15 that we all know. I mean, it's one of the most recognizable covers in comics that is done by Jack Kirby, even though the interiors and the co-creator of the character is Steve Ditko. That's because there was actually an Amazing Fantasy 15 character done by Ditko that was not used for whatever reason, whether it was a Stan Lee call or a Martin Goodman call. But, Todd and I each, like I said, have this book, Marvel Comics in the 1960s, that actually shows the Ditko cover. And it's got some similarities. It's got some similarities to that Kirby cover. It's coming at it from a different perspective. I gotta say, I'm kind of glad we wound up getting the Kirby cover because I think it's a little better. But it's interesting to see what the original concept for the cover was.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so more powerful. He looks a little bit more truly heroic, even though this is coming in the middle or the end of this run. Notice that they took the word adult out of Amazing Adult Fantasy because we've got a teenage hero here.
Mm-hmm.
This is no longer the comic that respects your intelligence.
They had an explanation for that in the letters section.
Yes.
They were like, we heard you talking, true believers. We understand that you felt uncomfortable buying a magazine that had the word adult in the title.
Adult. And notice he has not hyphenated Spider-Man on the cover.
Spider-Man.
Yeah, the hyphen only appears once or twice in the hair, but for the most part, no. Spider-Man is considered one word.
For the record, on the Ditko cover that was not used, it is hyphenated.
Ah, yes.
So the older I get, and the worse my old man eyes get, the more I see Fred Hembeck art in the interior of this story that I know by heart. I go back and look at it, and it looks like Fred Hembeck and his knobby knees and his skinny bodies. But Ditko is Ditko, and he always is very consistent with his art. But this issue looks more like Fred Hembeck than I remember, and a lot of bow-legged people throughout.
Very much so, yes.
So yeah, any final thoughts on Amazing Fantasy 15 from you guys before we move on?
Minor issue, no big deal.
Yeah, not at all important to what the company would become. But moving on from Amazing Fantasy 15 that has the first appearance of Spider-Man to Tales to Astonish, which while number 35, which while it is not technically the first appearance of Hank Pym, it is the first appearance of the Ant-Man. And not to bury it out of the gate, but my God, guys, like I can't think of a larger drop in quality between issues than that we read anyway, than that of between Amazing Fantasy 15 and Tales to Astonish 35.
There was only one question that came to mind as I finished reading this issue. Who gives a shit?
Yeah. The only really interesting aspect of this I want to talk about is the fact that they had created Hank Pym way back in a Tales to Astonish 27 in a story called The Man in the Anthill. And it was just kind of one of those one-off, like Twilight Zone style anthology stories that were appearing at the time. And then I think once Fantastic Four hit, and once they had Hulk going, and Journey into Mystery going, and Amazing Fantasy, Spider-Man going, they kind of retroactively turned this one-off character into the Ant-Man. And so that's kind of interesting to me from that standpoint. But like, honestly, this issue, the story, I couldn't tell you the first thing about it. Because I don't remember it because it was so godforsakenly boring. Something about Hank Pym's lab being broken into, and they're trying to steal his shrinking formula or something, and so he's trying to get out of there, and there's, I don't know, man. What did you guys think of this one?
And it's so stupid. There's no transformation by a suit. It's an actual chemical
that he has to be exposed to.
Yeah, that he has to put on himself in order to make this work. So that in itself becomes a cumbersome plot device. And as it goes along, you're like, okay, it's a robbery that he's going to stop by using this, and at some point or another, he has to figure out how to tame the ants by tapping into electronic frequencies that they apparently communicate by, which is not actually true of ants. They communicate by scent. And it's so weird. It's so just over the top and not well done at all. This was by far the worst issue that I read of all of these, and it given how bad this is, it even by the context and the standards of the day, kind of amazing to me that Ant-Man continued to be a thing. That anybody would have bothered with this beyond this issue, because this was pretty fucking bad.
Yeah, I would agree.
So it's weird to me that Tales to Astonish 27, Hank Pym's introduction, not as Ant-Man, but as you referenced, Nick, just as a character in a one-off anthology story, was not included in our reading list, only because I think that issue kind of fulfills the same sort of goal that Amazing Adult Fantasy number 7 did, of being an example of, hey, this is what comics were like pre-Fantastic Four number 1, right? But it kills two birds with one stone, because it's also an introduction to a very famous, iconic character that we will see again. So it's sort of weird that issue wasn't included.
The only thing I can think of was Tales to Astonish possibly bi-monthly at the time? Would it have even fallen? I think they're going strictly Fantastic Four number 1 forward. So would have 27 been pre-Fantastic Four?
No, it was published just a couple months after Fantastic Four #1.
Then I have no justification for this.
Yeah, it was kind of right in there with Amazing Adult Fantasy #7. So anyway, that's getting off a little bit, and that's because I don't have a lot to say about this issue, the introduction to Ant-Man. We get an education on ants, such as it is, and inaccurate as a lot of it is. Yes. Again, we've got some really good Stan pseudoscience of the helmet, which somehow manages to translate English and thoughts. So we're making two big leaps here to suspend your disbelief into, I guess, electrical signals that can be detected by ants and understood. Fair play, I guess, as these things go. The conceit of this potion that shrinks and then re-enlarges you. For the longest time with this character, he had PEM particles that had to be ingested, right, in order for him to actually utilize his powers. And a little bit later down the line, that would be integrated into his biology so that he could do it at will. But yeah, that is a weird limitation at this point in the character's history.
Yeah.
You have the Red Scare communist infiltrator, very boilerplate type conflict playing out, Yeah. And ultimately the protagonist not being that integral, I can't speak for some reason now, in the resolution of this story. He frees all of his colleagues, and then they kind of take care of the rest of it off panel. Yeah. So there's just a lot going on here that is...
They were put into an easily escapable trap, and everything was assumed to go to plan. What?
Yeah. I think the only really thing praiseworthy for me in this story is I dig the design of the Ant-Man costume. I like the little ant emblem going all the way up the chest and the helmet, and that kind of works for me. But I don't know, the rest of it's just kind of there. Todd, I mean, were you higher on this the rest of us, or are you going to tell us that we're all being a little bit too critical?
No, this is dumb. Luckily, I retained my full strength, or I might not have been able to push this test tube over. It's very by the numbers, very.
How convenient.
And then all he needs is one dip in the enlarging serum. So that's it. No, this is of tiny importance to the big picture.
Yeah, I would agree. Gave us Ant-Man. Other than that, not much to write home about. So let's go ahead and talk about the last issue we read for 1961/1962. And this is one that I feel like I might be the high man on because I've read it before, and good God, do I love it. This is Fantastic Four #9.
Let's kick this off with Namor. I've got to come out immediately. Underwater.
Watching television.
He's watching American News Bulletin. The Fantastic Four are bankrupt, and he's like, I've got a plan.
There are so many things to break down just about this opening that are great. Namor watching television underwater is one. Reed Richards, who we know will later become the smartest man in the Marvel Universe, losing all of the Fantastic Four's money playing the stock market is the other.
Yes.
Like, off-panel, I might add.
Yes, all this was done off-panel, so it's like, I don't even really understand where Jack and Stan were going with this.
Well,
but
he made some bad investments, you guys. It happened.
Yeah, apparently. And I love how Reed is using his stretch powers right here on this first panel of him talking to his investors, like he's trying to hold them all back. Like he's stretching around to make sure he's acknowledged everyone. He's like, I'm just going to reach around and touch you all now and let you know that I understand I've lost your money, and I'm going to cop this little feel here, and you're all going to feel a little bit better while I'm going to go over here I put my head in my hands.
And how the whole populace is so, what have you done for me lately?
Yes, they've been saved from, they've saved them from the Mole Man and Miracle Man and Doctor Doom and the Skrull Invasion and Namor, and all of a sudden now that they don't have any money anymore, now it's fuck you guys,
Okay, you got to be
Ben
out
Grimm
by tomorrow.
Should have been calling in the copyright on all things Blackbeard.
Yes, exactly.
God. He should have been like, "No, bitches, I am Blackbeard. Give me my money."
So Namor decides to take advantage of the Fantastic Four's newfound financial instability by setting up quite possibly the most nonsensical and elaborate plot in the history of nonsensical and elaborate supervillain plots. He, in the course of what is implied to be like 3 days, sees this report on the news, moves to Hollywood, buys a movie studio, renames it SM Studios, by the way, which is both a giant red flag to the Fantastic Four walking through the fucking door and also an overt sexual reference to whatever it is he wants to do with Sue Storm, I'm guessing. And decides to finance a Fantastic Four movie for $1 million that will bail them out of their financial issues. Yep. And then decides to shoot it Tropic Thunder style, where he just drops him into these situations and says, "Oh, we'll just film you from over here," even though he has no indication of doing so. And it is...
No script.
This is so ridiculous. It is like, to me, even more so than the Skrulls turning into cows, this is the peak in 1962 of ridiculous Fantastic Four stuff, and I 100% loved it.
Low-key favorite scene is Namor jumping up and down on Thing's shoulders.
Yes!
Multiple times to bury him into the ground.
Bury him into the ocean, right? Into the silt of the ocean?
Yep, into the silt of the ocean before he picks him back up and throws him in a headlock. But before that, two jump. Not just one, but two individual jumps, springboard jumps, off of and then back onto Thing's shoulders to bury him. Yep, that moment is just almost too much for me to take. I was not able to breathe during that scene.
When people say, Silver Age comics were a little bit shaky, I think this would be a prime example of that.
This would be the Katharine Hepburn of Silver Age comics.
I can't. Greg's not here, so I'm
not here. But oh my god!
I'm disinclined.
There's a Cyclops throwing a boulder at me.
Oh my god! This is the worst Fantastic Four movie that's been made since the 2005 Fantastic Four.
Namor!
Was I the only one who loved this?
No. I love the issue. It's absurd and it is hilarious.
Yeah.
And that's why it works.
Yes.
Yeah. It's just, you don't want to read this kind of thing.
How about Thing getting pissed off at dudes on Muscle Beach lifting weights so much so that he gathers them all up in his arms and throws them into the ocean?
Yes.
Very good.
I have no idea who any of these celebrities, save for Bing Crosby and Bob Hope, are in this issue. I think that might be Hitchcock there on the first page. I think my favorite thing is the brief Alicia Masters scene with Ben Grimm. Look, I made a doll for you. It's a kitten. I mean, it's a white knight.
White knight, yes.
You know what color it is, Alicia.
You're blind. I wonder if she spent an hour trying to masturbate by rubbing her shin vigorously in a very poor Anchorman 2 reference.
Good Lord.
I'll edit that out. All right.
No, you're not. And then the thing returning to, I guess it's not the Baxter building. It's just their random high-rise apartment that they reside in.
Right.
And declaring that, hey, look, I'm back on board, you guys. I am a white knight. And they're just sort of like, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about, but good to have you back in the mix, buddy. So more of this kind of very extreme characterization of Ben Grimm, where he's hot, he's cold, you can't really get a read on this guy, whether this is a character we're supposed to invest in or are thinking perhaps he will not be long for this world or this series.
How about this was also the first time that they point out that Namor has little wings on his feet.
Oh,
we saw it in Thor. We didn't see the wings, but they maybe mention them, and he's got his traditional green trunks instead of the red, orange.
Yeah. He's also capable of channeling all the powers of all sea life.
Mm-hmm. And he also has radar vision that he uses to spot Sue Storm and then attempt to carry her away to his underwater lair for whatever purposes he has in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Todd, I feel like you had a point you were trying to get to here.
Just that if they wrap these stories up so quickly.
Yes.
These last pages they cram, or the very last page they cram so much information. I want you to look at Sue Storm's forehead at the middle and the end. Poor Sue Storm's forehead is quite large.
Hector Hammond-esque.
It is.
Hector Hammond-esque.
But that's it. This is probably the height. This came out a full year after Fantastic Four #1, and I think they've gone monthly at this point too.
Yeah.
If you look at the issue number, so just looking at the bigger picture, all the things going on,
you can definitely tell
villain.
It had hit by this point. Like, it was a big hit, and they felt confident enough to have it take up one of those monthly slots every month.
Can we also point out that even though this movie that they were filming was clearly meant to be a snuff film, and they never really seemed to be all that into filming it. They're putting the individual members of the four into easily escapable traps and assuming it all went to plan. At the end of this issue, Sue calls out Namor for having been defeated, so now he's got to make good on his contract. Because that's got to totally be the thing he's most concerned with. Oh, my God, if I don't fulfill that, they're going to sue my fish ass. And he's like, the movie will be produced as promised. You will get your money. I was like, this is a thing that's happened. Not only is that a thing that happened, but this is the only time in history whenever there's been a hit Fantastic Four movie.
Yes!
You beat me to that joke.
The best Fantastic Four movie, right?
Yeah, it's like a hit Fantastic Four movie. Only in the pages of a comic book, folks. That's the most comic booky thing in this whole issue.
Tremendous.
Don't forget, whatever Namor did, he did for love.
He did for love, so they just explain it all away and say, he must not be that bad of a guy. We'll just let him go off into the ocean. He'll be fine. We'll never see him again. Little did we know.
And it's yet another ending text box here that makes it sound like this is the final issue of the series, because it's like the Fantastic Four once again have the money to carry on their unique life's work, and our saga is ended.
I guess you could think of, Stan always said every comic is somebody's first comic. Perhaps every comic is somebody's last comic. So I guess that's also a thing to keep in mind.
And given that philosophy, most of these Marvel comics from the early days were approached as being both.
Yeah, there you go.
This will be your first and last Marvel comic you ever buy.
And the turnover of the readership back then was something that had been remarked upon, where it was like people who are reading your comic today, we can't expect are going to be the same people reading it 3 years from now, right? Mm-hmm. Like that was how fast they figured that churn was.
But there is another narration box that they put at the very, very end of this that also does show that, yes, this book had gone monthly by now, because it says next month there will be more thrills and surprises as this whole thing continues on. But but yeah, the incredible exploits and down-to-earth realism truly make this the world's greatest comic magazine. that was definitely written by Stan.
Looking at the math, with 5 being released in July of 62, they must have gone monthly, starting with number 6 in September of 1962, and that would have gotten you to number 9 in December. So that would have a little less than a year after going or for debuting with number 1 is they made the move to monthly because of the massive success of the title.
And it makes sense. This title has definitely grown a lot, and just over the course of the issues that we read, like looking back at Fantastic Four number 1 and comparing it to Fantastic Four number 9, it is night and day difference. Issue 9 is incredibly entertaining, a whole lot of fun. So, yeah, this has been a very interesting delve into our first year, or 13 months, as it were, of Marvel, of the first real emergence of Marvel superheroes.
So yeah, that's the final issue on our reading list for the year for 1961-1962. So real quickly, final thoughts on the year. Todd, let's start with you.
Boy, you got to see a lot of things change, and superheroes become the dominant form for Marvel. We didn't check back in on the Hulk, but we saw them trying to mix in superheroes and superheroics as much as you can. You could also see Lee and Kirby, especially in the Fantastic Four book, cram more story into it, cram more art into it, cram more long-term concepts and interesting character development. Usually comics before this point, at least for Marvel, were done in one. And even though we used the same characters, or you'd have stories that were one issue long, you'd see long-term character development with the Fantastic Four. So, yeah, it's been interesting to see. Stories are as sophisticated, I guess, as they can be for the era, but still a lot of fun, and really enjoying seeing the Jack Kirby art and the Steve Ditko art, particularly.
So real quick, you can't really give us a writer of the year because it's pretty much all Stan, but and the artist category isn't very, very competitive either. But give us your preferred artist of this year, and also tell us your favorite of the stories that we read.
It's going to be Kirby and Fantastic Four number 5. Those are my favorite artist and favorite single issue.
Awesome. And I think you have to run here, so do you want to plug your social media or anything else you got going on before you head out the door?
No, not particularly. You hear me a lot on these shows, so one of these days, Tim, Capel, and I will put on the Conversation Comics superhero costumes and capes, and we will get the show back on the air. Just moved my podcast studio, extensive as it is, into my bedroom, so hopefully I'll be able to do a little bit more podcasting without interfering with normal family activities. So we'll see. Let's hope for the better, and continue to check out the amazing podcast here on Place to Be Nation. Pop!
Awesome.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you, sir. So, Tim, let's hear your final thoughts on 1961/1962, and along the way, give us your favorite story that we read and your artist of the year.
Okay, well, I know we just read a sampling of a year and some change worth of comics, but it almost feels like this is about 5 years worth of story.
It really does burn through a lot of story, and it does feel like they pretty quickly identified what the formula was and evolved it pretty out of the gate pretty quickly.
There's so much packed in here. These are pretty dense issues in terms of plot. We talked about how origins are kind of blown through with almost reckless abandon in some cases, but in a way, it's kind of to the benefit of your reading experience. So a lot of this stuff is, as I say, a curio, where it's not quite the cream of the crop yet, but has that historical significance where it's interesting. You want to follow along and track the development of what these things would become and how they are perceived by audiences today. I would say, for my money, Thor Don't Quit. Journey into Mystery / Thor springs almost, not quite, but almost fully formed from the jump.
Mm-hmm.
And Fantastic Four is anything but. Mm-hmm. So I don't know how surprising or not that may be to people, but that is definitely my experience in looking back on this stuff. So all that said, I would have to give it to Jack Kirby as my artist of the year / years for his efforts on Journey into Mystery / Thor. Mm-hmm. Really great stuff that I think by the standards of the time and by the standards of today is quite fetching still.
And your story of the year?
Story of the year, again, I will just, it's tempting to say Amazing Fantasy 15, right? But I feel like we've all sort of read that, and we know the origin of Spider-Man and how iconic it is, and it is very good, but just pound for pound and for what I was expecting versus what I got, I'm going to say Journey into Mystery 83.
There you go. Good to hear. Russell, your final thoughts on November of 61 through the end of 62, and give us your artist and story of the year.
Final thoughts are that this is a really cool thing to look back on to see how much evolution has taken place in the time since. So if you really want to get an appreciation for where your comics are now, you need to go back and read some of these. Take full advantage of Marvel Unlimited. And
yeah, geez, if you don't have Marvel Unlimited, you're a dumb.
Yeah, it's dumb. Really calling back the 60s there with that one, Todd. But you're a dumb Dugan even.
Which we will get to on our next episode.
Yes.
Also, I forgot. This is a tidbit from earlier. I used to know him as the Submariner. There you go. And I know I'm not the only one.
You're not.
But yes. Anyway, this has been a fun project so far. This is going to be even more fun as we go forward to see how these characters and concepts continue to evolve. Some great ideas are being presented by Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and Steve Ditko. I think I'm going to have to. This is a tough one. I'll go with artist first. And initially, I didn't think I was going to wind up giving it to him, but I got to give it to Jack Kirby for his just marked improvement from where Fantastic Four #1 starts us to where we are at Fantastic Four #9. Tremendous upswing. But it is, and I know that Tim called this out. He said Journey into Mystery 83, and I was real close on 85. But I'll go for the cliche because it's the near and dear to my heart. Amazing Fantasy 15's Spider-Man origin and that Steve Ditko art is just some of the most tremendous stuff that I think I would have been able to find in that day. Though I do think that Jack Kirby for this year winds up being the better artist. So with that, Spider-Man's origin, but Jack Kirby on art is are my picks for the best of 61 to 62.
Gotcha. For me, this is really cool because it's fun, always fun to look back at some of these Silver Age comics and kind of look at them from a modern context and see how they hold up. It's especially fun to do so with people's, whose opinions you respect and get to hear all you guys kind of, break them down and stuff.
And mine.
I was talking about all you guys, especially yours, Todd. You and Tim, honestly, were the two people I was looking forward to the most hearing talk about these things, just because you're huge Marvel aficionados. Todd, I feel like you have a greater understanding of comics history than certainly than I do. So, been a ton of fun being on here with you guys. But I guess the way I would describe it, it's been really interesting to see what characters there are, like Thor, for example, who kind of came out of the gate, like Tim said, fully formed, and then other concepts and characters who are still kind of in an incubator, so to speak, where they're still kind of in development, where they haven't yet hit that point where they feel fully recognizable as the characters we know today. The Hulk, I think, is probably the prime example of that, at least from this initial 61-62 period. And in terms of story of the year, for me, it's a clear-cut Journey into Mystery number 85. That Journey into Mystery where we get to see the Asgardian elements introduced, where we see Loki, Heimdall, Odin, Thor, Tyr, Balder, all there kind of all at once. And the development of that Thor-Loki dynamic, that's my story of the year. And while I said earlier that I prefer the Steve Ditko art to Jack Kirby art as a whole, I think I still stand by that. But, you know, for this list that we read, there's so little Ditko on it. Ditko has amazing Adult Fantasy 7, and he has amazing Fantasy 15, and everything else on our list was drawn by Jack Kirby. And so
the anthology books, Ditko did a lot of the backups in those, including the Journey into Mystery that we didn't see and the Tales to Astonish. There were Ditko work in there.
Right. I guess what I'm saying is, for the purposes of our discussion, the stuff we actually talked about today, it was like, what, 80 to 85% Kirby? And so while I think he struggled a little bit early on, like Russell said, he got so much better by the time the year was out. And his sheer output on this list, I feel like you have to give it to him by default. But I'm interested to see if that holds true in future years. So I'll make it a clean sweep for Kirby on Artist of the Year, but I'm going to go Journey into Mystery 85. So I like that we all each had different stories of the year here in this initial period. So that about puts a bow on it for the first episode of the Marvel Age podcast. By all means, reach out to us via the Place to Be Nation Comics Facebook page, via our individual Twitter handles. I am at NickDuke87. You guys are?
I am at Russell_Sellers.
I am at Psych68. CYAE68.
Mm-hmm.
I am at Todd Weber Guitar. And also at I Hate Kevin Durant.
There it is.
Right.
Working the gimmick.
Very good.
But by all means, guys, if you listen to this, if you have any thoughts on 1961, 1962 Marvel, if you have any feedback on the show, please reach out to us. Let us hear that feedback. If you want to get in and read along with us, feel free to reach out and we'll provide you with some links to the stuff we're looking at. Once again, a shout out to comicbookherald.com and his My Marvelous Year project that we're kind of using as the basis for this podcast. So if you want to read along with us for 1963, that'll be our next episode. I don't know exactly when it's coming, but I can tell you 1963 has a little bit more variety here, whereas 61, 62 was mostly Fantastic Four with a little, some little origin stories sprinkled in. 63 is very dynamic. You've got on our reading list some Fantastic Four, some Amazing Spider-Man, some the Iron Man debut, Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos, some Tales to Astonish. I'm trying to remember what exactly that is. Somebody help me out. What's the Tales to Astonish on our list?
Is it Ant-Man and Wasp?
It's Ant-Man and Wasp. That's what it is. Thank you. The debut of the Wasp. Some Doctor Strange, which I cannot wait to get into on this podcast. And, of course, at the end of the year, arguably the two most notable titles of that year, Avengers #1 and Uncanny X-Men #1, both in 1963. So 63 is going to be a hell of a year. I'm looking forward to doing it, and I hope you guys are as well. So unless anybody else has anything they want to add, I have loved doing this with you guys. I can't wait for another episode to our listeners, and stay tuned for 1963 to be covered in the second episode of the Marvel Age podcast featuring the Sarcastic Four.
The Fantastic Four, starring Reed Richards, Sue Richards, Johnny Storm, Ben Grimm. Reed Richards with his power to stretch. The Thing with the strength of 1,000 men. Johnny, Flame On Torch, and Sue, the Invisible Girl. The Fantastic Four, united in their fight against interplanetary evil. Fantastic! The Fantastic Four. Fantastic!
Something is pulling it down.
Remember Einstein's theory that the universe is like a ball? We have just passed through the subspace edge of the ball.
I command you, drop your cloak of invisibility. Good. You obey. Just in time to perish with your friends. Goodbye, Human Torch.
Even a sonic blast can be completely smothered like this.
What's this? Something is preventing me from pushing this button. This is impossible. Nothing shall stop the Mole Man.
Here goes. By holding my breath and flexing my muscles thusly, I did it.
I'll push this button and all the major cities of the world will disappear into the earth forever. Hey, what? Sis, you arrived just in the nick of time.
You look great, Ben. How did it happen, and who is he?
This is my friend, the great Diablo. I'll stop him with this sand, master.
I've flamed.
You lied to me.
Prepare to fire. Now let me get out of this asbestos suit, and I'll tell you all about it.
Pick up the gun. Shoot.
I shall be the first mortal, the first human being on the moon. And the first man to land on the moon shall rule the world. What is happening to this gun?